And welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. The story of the Second World War does not begin with Hitler marching into Poland in September of 1939. It does not even begin in the 1930s, with Mussolini's parades in Rome or Japan's soldiers advancing into Manchuria. To truly understand why the world plunged into another catastrophic conflict, we must return to the moment when the guns of the First World War fell silent. November 11th, 1918. The Armistice. A day that brought joy, yes, but also confusion, bitterness, and wounds so deep they would not heal in a single generation. The First World War was supposed to have been the war to end all wars. In reality, it was only an intermission. The Second World War was born in its ashes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Europe in 1918 looked like a continent torn from its foundations. Vast stretches of northern France and Belgium were reduced to wasteland. Villages that had stood for centuries were now piles of stone. Churches, schools, and farms lay in ruins. In some regions, farmers ploughed their fields only to bring up bones and unexploded shells. Trees were reduced to blackened stumps. Mud still clung to trenches that zigzagged across the landscape like scars. And in towns far from the front, the absence of young men was felt in every shop, every church pew, every family gathering. Nearly 10 million soldiers were dead, another 20 million wounded, and millions of civilians gone. The lost generation was not just a poetic phrase, it was a reality lived every day. In Britain, war memorials sprang up in nearly every village, each one etched with rows of names. In France, whole towns mourned sons who would never return, their fields tended now by widows and children. In Germany, the grief was deepened by humiliation, for defeat came not only on the battlefield but also in the minds of many who believed they had been betrayed. The sense of mourning was universal, but its expression differed. Some prayed, some built monuments, others drank, trying to drown the memories of mud, rats, gas, and death. When the victors gathered in Paris in 1919 to decide the terms of peace, they came with their own wounds and their own agendas. The French, led by Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, demanded harsh punishment. France had been invaded twice in living memory, and Clemenceau wanted to make sure Germany could never rise again. The British, under David Lloyd George, tried to balance retribution with practicality, fearing that too much punishment might destabilize Europe. And the Americans, guided by President Woodrow Wilson, came with dreams of a new world order, a League of Nations, and self-determination for all peoples. These competing visions clashed in smoke-filled rooms and grand halls of Paris. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. For Germany, the treaty was devastating. It stripped the nation of its colonies in Africa and the Pacific. It reduced its army to 100,000 men, barely enough to maintain order at home, and forbade tanks, planes, and submarines. Its navy was gutted. The Rhineland, a vital industrial region, was to be demilitarized. Alsace and Lorraine were returned to France. The Polish corridor split Germany in two, severing East Prussia from the rest of the country. And looming above all else was reparations. 132 billion gold marks, a sum so large it could never realistically be paid. German politicians signed the treaty reluctantly, under the threat of renewed invasion. Many saw it not as peace, but as humiliation. In cafes, in veterans' clubs, in homes across the nation, bitterness took root. The word diktat, dictated peace, echoed with venom. The years that followed were a nightmare for ordinary Germans. In 1923, inflation spiraled out of control. the government, struggling to meet reparations payments, printed money at a frantic pace. At first, prices rose slowly, then faster, then wildly. Soon the currency was worthless. A loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Housewives rushed to the market twice a day before prices doubled by evening. Children played with stacks of banknotes as if they were building blocks. Families who had saved for decades saw their life savings vanish overnight. A photograph from the time shows a man using banknotes as wallpaper because it was cheaper than buying actual paper. Farmers refused to sell food for currency that lost value by the hour. People starved in the shadow of granaries. And yet, even amid this chaos, life continued. Couples still married, though rings were often made of tin. Schools tried to teach, though teachers went unpaid. Berlin cabarets pulsed with jazz and dance, imported from America, offering temporary escape from despair. Writers, painters, and thinkers flocked to the capital, producing daring works that challenged old traditions. But beneath the glitter of the so-called Golden Twenties lurked anger, humiliation, and longing for stability. Many Germans looked at their fragile democracy, the Weimar Republic, and saw weakness. The memory of order, even authoritarian order, began to feel tempting. Germany was not the only nation in turmoil. Across Europe, empires had crumbled. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was carved into new states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The Ottoman Empire collapsed, leaving the Middle East divided into British and French mandates. The Russian Empire had already fallen to revolution in 1917, giving birth to the Soviet Union after years of civil war. Poland reappeared on the map after more than a century of absence. But these new borders, drawn in the ink of diplomats, ignored centuries of ethnic, religious, and linguistic divisions. Tensions simmered, waiting to explode. In Italy, victory in the war felt hollow. Italians had been promised territorial rewards for joining the Allies, but many of these promises were not kept. Discontent spread through factories and farms. Strikes erupted. Workers occupied factories. Landless peasants demanded reform. Into this chaos marched Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned nationalist, with his black shirts and his rhetoric of strength, unity, and rebirth. In 1922, his march on Rome brought him to power as prime minister. Soon, Italy became the first fascist state, a model that would inspire others, including a young German veteran named Adolf Hitler. The scars of war were not only physical or political, they were deeply psychological. Veterans returned from the front carrying invisible wounds. Shell shock, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted them. Some stuttered uncontrollably, others trembled at loud noises. Many could not speak of what they had seen. Families struggled to understand husbands, brothers, and sons, who came home but were never truly the same. Writers like Erich Maria Remarque captured this despair in novels such as All Quiet on the Western Front, a story that painted the war not as glorious but as senseless slaughter. The book resonated across borders, though in Germany it angered nationalists who claimed it dishonored the dead. Cemeteries multiplied across the continent. Rows upon rows of white crosses stretched into the horizon in Flanders and Normandy. Monuments were raised in town squares, engraved with names of the fallen, sometimes so many that entire communities seemed inscribed in stone. The rituals of mourning became part of daily life. Bells tolled each November 11th, and schools observed moments of silence. Yet even as people grieved, questions lingered. Was the war truly fought for freedom? Had so many died in vain? Could the peace last? Or was another storm already gathering? In Britain, the empire seemed intact, yet cracks appeared. Colonies that had contributed men and resources demanded recognition and self-rule. In India, the independence movement gained momentum, inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's calls for non-violent resistance. In Ireland, war and rebellion led to the creation of the Irish Free State in 1922, a wound that reshaped the British Isles. France, though victorious, was exhausted. Its fields were scarred, its treasury drained. It built the Maginot Line, a vast chain of fortifications along its border with Germany, hoping to prevent another invasion. But the line was more psychological comfort than true defense. The United States, having entered the war late but decisively, emerged as a global power. Yet many Americans turned inward in the 1920s, embracing isolationism. The Senate refused to join the League of Nations, leaving Wilson's dream of collective security weakened from the start. America's roaring 20s brought prosperity and innovation, but also a sense of distance from Europe's troubles. When Wall Street collapsed in 1929, the shockwaves would spread worldwide, plunging nations into depression and despair. The fragility of democracy was evident across Europe. The Weimar Republic in Germany faced coups from both left and right. Communist uprisings rattled cities, while nationalist paramilitaries brawled in the streets. In Eastern Europe, monarchies gave way to authoritarian regimes, promising stability in exchange for liberty. Fear of communism, fear of chaos, fear of humiliation, these became the tools of those who promised order, even at the cost of freedom. Yet for a brief moment in the mid-1920s, it seemed peace might endure. Germany joined the League of Nations in 1926. Treaties like Locarno sought to guarantee borders. The Dawes Plan and later the Young Plan restructured reparations, bringing loans from America that temporarily stabilized the German economy. Cities bustled again. Berlin became a hub of modern art, architecture, and science. Jazz bands played, Bauhaus designers reimagined buildings, and women claimed new freedoms in fashion and work. The world exhaled, believing perhaps the nightmare was over. But it was only a pause. Beneath the surface, resentments remained. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the fragile stability collapsed. Factories closed, banks failed, unemployment soared. In Germany, 6 million were jobless by 1932. Families scavenged for coal along railway tracks. Soup kitchens overflowed. Farmers lost land to foreclosure. The Weimar government seemed powerless. Extremists seized the moment. Communists promised revolution. National Socialists promised revival. Crowds gathered in beer halls listening to Adolf Hitler's fiery speeches about betrayal, humiliation, and rebirth. The swastika spread across banners and armbands. Hope and hatred mingled in equal measure. Elsewhere, authoritarianism gained ground. In Japan, economic crisis fueled militarism. The army seized Manchuria in 1931, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo, defying international condemnation. In Italy, Mussolini tightened his grip, building a cult of personality around himself as Il Duce. Across the world, fragile democracies faltered, while strong men rose. The world had survived one great war, but it had not found a lasting peace. The wounds of 1918 had never healed. They had only festered, waiting for a new conflict to erupt. The ashes of the Great War left more than ruins and graves. They left a psychological scar across generations. They left bitterness in Germany, fear in France, exhaustion in Britain, ambition in Italy, and revolution in Russia. They left a League of Nations too weak to prevent aggression, and economies too fragile to withstand crisis. They left millions of ordinary people searching for meaning, for security, for someone to blame. And in that searching, the world turned toward leaders who promised certainty, leaders who would soon lead humanity into an even greater abyss. Fascism and dictatorship take root. The 1920s had been years of uncertainty, but the 1930s were years of reckoning. Across Europe and beyond, the scars of the First World War deepened rather than healed. Economic collapse, social unrest, and disillusionment with democracy created fertile soil for new and dangerous ideologies. The old order had crumbled in the trenches of 1914, 1918, but the new order was yet to be decided. Into this vacuum stepped strongmen charismatic, ruthless, and unyielding, who promised not compromise, but certainty. They promised revival, not debate, and they demanded obedience in exchange for salvation. This was the birth of fascism and dictatorship, and it would reshape the world. Italy was the first great experiment. At the end of the First World War, Italy had been counted among the victors, yet it felt cheated. Promises made by Britain and France during the war, territorial rewards for joining the Allies had not been fulfilled. Italians called it the mutilated victory. Soldiers who had bled in the Alps and along the Isonzo returned to poverty, unemployment, and disillusionment. Strikes broke out in factories. Farmers occupied estates, demanding land reform. Socialist parties gained strength, alarming industrialists and landowners. The fragile Italian government seemed powerless to contain the unrest. In the chaos, a former socialist turned nationalist seized his chance. Benito Mussolini was not born into wealth or privilege. The son of a blacksmith, he had grown up in a modest home in northern Italy. A fiery speaker, he had once supported socialism, but by the end of the war he reinvented himself as a prophet of national rebirth. In 1919 he founded the Fasci di Combattimento, the fascist movement, named after the fasces, the ancient Roman symbol of authority. His followers, known as blackshirts, were ex-soldiers, disillusioned youths, and thugs who marched through towns, breaking strikes, attacking socialists, and parading with military discipline. To some, they looked like saviors. To others, they looked like bullies. But to Mussolini, they were the seeds of revolution. By 1922, Mussolini saw his moment. Italy's governments had collapsed in rapid succession, unable to deal with strikes and economic turmoil. The country was exhausted. In October, Mussolini organized the March on Rome, a show of force in which tens of thousands of blackshirts descended on the capital. They did not overthrow the state by violence. Rather, they intimidated it into submission. King Victor Emmanuel III, fearful of civil war, invited Mussolini to form a government. Within a few years, Mussolini dismantled democracy. Opposition parties were banned, censorship was imposed, and the state declared itself a dictatorship. Mussolini proclaimed himself Il Duce, the leader. His regime glorified the Roman Empire, held mass rallies, and promised that Italy would rise again as a great power. The world had witnessed the birth of fascism. In Germany, the path was slower but more explosive. The Weimar Republic, born from the ashes of the war, was fragile from the start. Its very existence was tainted by association with defeat and the hated Treaty of Versailles. Politicians who signed the treaty were branded traitors, accused of stabbing the nation in the back. Hyperinflation in 1923 had left scars that no one forgot. The fragile stability of the late 1920s, propped up by American loans, collapsed like a house of cards when Wall Street crashed in 1929. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. Farmers lost land, workers lost jobs, families scavenged for food. Democracy seemed powerless to respond. Amid the despair rose Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria in 1889, Hitler had been a failed artist, rejected by Vienna's art academies. He had drifted through life until the Great War, when he served as a soldier on the Western Front. He was wounded, decorated, and embittered by Germany's defeat. After the war, he remained in the army and was sent to spy on small political groups. One of these was the German Workers' Party, a tiny nationalist movement. Hitler did not remain a spy for long. He joined it, then transformed it. With his fiery speeches and relentless energy, he turned it into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. The early years were chaotic. In 1923, Hitler attempted a coup in Munich, the Beer Hall Putsch. Inspired by Mussolini's March on Rome, he hoped to seize power with a show of force. It failed. The police opened fire, and 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to prison. But in prison, he found opportunity. There he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a book that laid out his ideology: hatred of Jews, contempt for communism, belief in German racial superiority, and a vision of conquest and expansion in the East. Few read it seriously at the time, but it would become the blueprint for the most destructive regime in history. Released after less than a year, Hitler shifted tactics. He would not overthrow the state by force. He would enter it by the ballot. The Nazis built a propaganda machine unlike anything seen before. They used posters, radio, films, and mass rallies to spread their message. They offered simple answers to complex problems. Germany was suffering because of traitors, Jews, and communists. Germany could be great again under strong leadership. Their symbol, the swastika, became a banner of identity and defiance. Stormtroopers, the SA, marched in the streets, brawling with opponents and projecting an image of discipline and power. Slowly, the party grew from a fringe movement to a mass phenomenon. When the Depression struck, the Nazis' appeal soared. By 1932, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. In January 1933, after backroom deals and political maneuvering, President Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor. Within months, a fire destroyed the Reichstag building. The Nazis blamed communists, spread fear of revolution, and persuaded the government to pass emergency laws granting Hitler dictatorial powers. Democracy ended with a legal vote. By the summer of 1933, the Nazi Party was the only legal party in Germany. Hitler was Führer leader, and the Third Reich was born. While Italy and Germany pioneered fascism, another kind of dictatorship was tightening its grip in the East. The Soviet Union, born from the Russian Revolution of 1917, was still young and fragile in the 1920s. After the death of Vladimir Lenin in 1924, a struggle for power erupted within the Communist Party. The winner was Joseph Stalin. Short, mustached, and seemingly unremarkable, Stalin proved to be one of the most ruthless leaders in history. He eliminated rivals through cunning, manipulation, and terror. Leon Trotsky, his most prominent opponent, was exiled, then later assassinated in Mexico with an ice pick. By the early 1930s, Stalin was unchallenged master of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rule transformed the Soviet Union into a state of fear. He launched massive industrialization drives, forcing peasants into collective farms. Millions resisted, and millions starved, particularly in Ukraine during the Holodomor famine of 1932-1933. At the same time, Stalin's secret police carried out purges, arresting, torturing, and executing those accused of being enemies of the people. The Gulag system expanded, sending millions to forced labor camps in Siberia. Yet despite the terror, Stalin achieved rapid industrial growth. Factories, dams, and railways rose across the Soviet landscape. The Soviet Union became a modern power, but at an almost unimaginable human cost. Meanwhile, across the world in Asia, Japan was undergoing its own transformation. After the Meiji Restoration of the 19th century, Japan had modernized rapidly, defeating Russia in 1905 and joining the ranks of world powers. In the First World War, it fought alongside the Allies, seizing German possessions in the Pacific. But by the 1930s, Japan faced economic depression and growing militarism. Civilian governments struggled to control an increasingly aggressive army. In 1931, Japanese officers staged the Mukden Incident, a staged railway explosion that provided a pretext to invade Manchuria. The civilian government tried to stop them, but the army acted independently. Manchuria was seized, and the puppet state of Manchukuo was established. The League of Nations condemned the action, but did nothing. Japan simply withdrew from the League. The lesson was clear: aggression would go unpunished. What united these regimes, Italy's fascism, Germany's Nazism, Stalin's communism and Japan's militarism was their rejection of democracy. They despised compromise, debate, and pluralism. They glorified strength, obedience, and unity. They created cults of personality, elevating their leaders into near-divine figures. Mussolini was Il Duce, Hitler was Führer, Stalin was the Man of Steel, and Japan's Emperor Hirohito was revered as a living god. Propaganda saturated daily life. Children were taught to chant slogans. Newspapers printed only approved words. Radios carried only the voices of the regime. Art, architecture, and film were harnessed to glorify the state. For ordinary people, life under these regimes was a mixture of fear and belonging. To oppose the state was dangerous arrest, imprisonment, or worse. But to go along offered a sense of identity, purpose, and stability. After years of chaos, uncertainty, and humiliation, many found the simplicity of the message appealing. Obey the leader, follow the nation, and the future will be secure. Not everyone believed, but enough did to make resistance difficult. And those who did not believe often stayed silent, afraid of consequences. By the 1930s, the world was dividing. Democracies in Britain, France, and the United States were weakened by economic crisis and political division. Authoritarian powers in Italy, Germany, the Soviet Union, and Japan were rising, bold and aggressive. The League of Nations, created to preserve peace, proved powerless. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League protested but took no meaningful action. When Germany rearmed in defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, the League did nothing. When Japan expanded further in China, the League could only watch. The old dream of collective security was collapsing. The rise of fascism and dictatorship was not inevitable, but it was understandable. The First World War had left wounds that democracy struggled to heal. Economic collapse stripped people of hope. Fear of communism drove elites to support authoritarianism. National pride demanded revenge for humiliation. Propaganda offered simple answers to complex problems. And human beings, weary of uncertainty, longed for strong leaders who promised clarity and action. These regimes did not seize power by force alone. They were welcomed by many who believed they were the solution. In that choice lay the tragedy of the age. By the end of the 1930s, the stage was set. Fascist Italy dreamed of empire in Africa. Nazi Germany plotted revenge against Versailles. Stalin's Soviet Union armed itself in paranoia. Japan sought domination of Asia. The democracies hesitated, divided and uncertain. The dictators had risen, and soon they would test the world with fire. The world in crisis. The decade of the 1930s opened not with hope, but with despair. The global economy had collapsed, the fragile democracies of Europe faltered, and the promises of peace from 1919 rang hollow. All across the world, men and women felt as if they were living through the unraveling of civilization itself. The First World War had shattered the old empires. The Great Depression seemed to be finishing off whatever stability remained. In this crisis, extremism thrived. Moderate voices were drowned out by the loud, the angry, and the uncompromising. The world was sick, and it seemed only ruthless physicians claimed to have the cure. The Great Depression began in the United States with the Wall Street crash of October 1929, but its effects rippled outward with unstoppable force. America had been the financial engine of the post-war world, providing loans to Germany to pay reparations, to Britain and France to rebuild, and to countless other nations to stimulate trade. When the markets collapsed, that lifeline was severed. Banks failed, factories closed, trade ground to a halt. By the early 1930s, unemployment in Germany soared to 6 million, in Britain to 3 million, in the United States to 15 million. Families sold furniture for food. Men wandered city streets searching for work that did not exist. Soup kitchens overflowed. Children fainted in classrooms from hunger. For many, the depression felt like a betrayal. Had they not already endured the Great War? Had they not been promised peace, prosperity, and stability? Instead, they were faced with hunger and uncertainty. Trust in democratic governments seen as weak, indecisive, and corrupt plummeted. The crisis opened the door wider for extremists. In Germany, the Nazis offered scapegoats and slogans. In Italy, Mussolini boasted that fascism alone could provide strength. In Japan, military leaders argued that conquest was the only way to feed the nation. And in the Soviet Union, Stalin promised that communism, however brutal, was the future. In Germany, the collapse of the economy was catastrophic. Families that had clung to hope after the humiliation of Versailles now lost everything. Farmers saw their crops fetch nothing on the market. Factories stood silent, chimneys cold. Beggars lined the streets of Berlin and Hamburg. The Weimar Republic, already fragile, was paralyzed. Successive governments rose and fell in rapid succession. Politicians argued in the Reichstag while outside. Unemployed workers marched and paramilitary groups brawled. Democracy seemed incapable of addressing the crisis. And in the chaos, Hitler's voice grew louder. The Nazi Party capitalized on despair with ruthless efficiency. Their propaganda was simple. Germany's suffering was not an accident, it was a crime. The culprits, they insisted, were communists, Jews, and corrupt politicians. Posters showed proud workers marching under the swastika, farmers smiling in golden fields, soldiers saluting the Führer. It was an image of order, strength, and rebirth. For millions, it was irresistible. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest party in the Reichstag. The world in crisis was handing them power. In the Soviet Union, the depression struck differently. Stalin's regime had already insulated itself from global capitalism, but the cost was enormous human suffering. His forced collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s led to famine on a scale the world had never seen. In Ukraine, the Holodomor killed millions. Entire villages starved while grain was requisitioned for export. At the same time, Stalin launched his 5-year plans to industrialize at breakneck speed. New steel mills, factories, and railways rose, often built with forced labor. The gulags swelled with prisoners, kulaks, political opponents, intellectuals, anyone deemed an enemy of the state. For Stalin, crisis was opportunity. He used fear to consolidate total power, purging the Communist Party, the military, and society itself. The Soviet Union became both a fortress and a prison, admired by some abroad for its apparent vitality, feared by many for its brutality. In Japan, the depression deepened the country's dependence on imports for raw materials and food. Silk, its chief export, collapsed in price, devastating farmers. Hungry and desperate, many looked to the military for solutions. Army leaders claimed that Japan's destiny lay in conquest, seizing land in China and Southeast Asia to secure resources. Civilian governments tried to restrain the generals, but they were swept aside. In 1931, Japanese officers staged the Mukden incident, using a staged railway explosion as a pretext to invade Manchuria. The civilian government protested, but the army had already acted. The League of Nations condemned Japan's aggression but did nothing. Japan simply withdrew. It was a chilling lesson. International law meant little if no one would enforce it. In Italy, Mussolini embraced crisis as proof of his ideology's necessity. Fascism, he boasted, was immune to the weaknesses of democracy. He cracked down on strikes, censored the press, and declared that the state would direct the economy. Grand public works roads, buildings, propaganda spectacles were meant to project strength. Yet beneath the surface, Italy's economy remained weak, dependent on foreign imports and burdened with debt. Mussolini's answer was expansion. Ethiopia, one of the few independent nations in Africa, became his target. In 1935, Italian forces invaded, using poison gas and brutal tactics. The League of Nations again protested, even imposed sanctions, but they were half-hearted. Britain and France feared alienating Mussolini, whom they still hoped might balance Hitler. Ethiopia fell, its Emperor Haile Selassie pleading in vain at the League's assembly. Fascist Italy had shown that aggression paid. The crisis of the 1930s was not confined to Europe and Asia. In the United States, the Depression left deep scars. Farmers in the Dust Bowl lost crops to drought and dust storms. Their land turned to wasteland. Families packed their belongings into trucks and migrated west in search of work, immortalized in Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. Unemployed men lined city streets with signs reading, "We'll work for food." President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with the New Deal, massive public works, social programs, and financial reforms. Slowly, confidence returned. But while America focused inward, fascism abroad gained strength. Isolationism dominated American politics. Few wanted involvement in Europe's or Asia's troubles. This hesitation would shape the years to come. In France and Britain, the Depression weakened political will. In France, governments changed rapidly, often lasting only months. Strikes paralyzed industries. Fear of communism divided the nation. In Britain, unemployment in industrial regions soared, leading to protests and hunger marches. The empire remained vast, but its people felt weary, uncertain, and anxious about another war. Memories of 1914, 1918 were still raw. Millions remembered the trenches, the gas, the slaughter. The instinct was not to confront new threats, but to avoid them at almost any cost. The world in crisis created a moral vacuum. The institutions meant to preserve peace failed. The League of Nations was paralyzed, unable to act against aggression. Democracies, weakened by economic hardship, hesitated. The dictators exploited this vacuum ruthlessly. Each success emboldened them. Japan in Manchuria, Mussolini in Ethiopia, Hitler in Germany, defying Versailles by rearming, remilitarizing the Rhineland in 1936, and facing no consequences. Step by step, the post-war order was dismantled. For ordinary people, the crisis was lived in daily struggles. In Berlin, unemployed men sold pencils on street corners. In rural Ukraine, families boiled grass and bark to survive famine. In Tokyo, workers marched demanding bread, while newspapers praised military victories in Manchuria. In Rome, children saluted Mussolini in schools, reciting fascist slogans. In Chicago and New York, families stood in bread lines, while radios carried Roosevelt's fireside chats promising that recovery was possible. Everywhere, the crisis reshaped expectations, values, and loyalties. It created a world where people sought strong answers, even if they came from dangerous leaders. The 1930s were not only a time of political and economic crisis, they were also a crisis of faith. Faith in democracy, in progress, in peace. The generation that had fought the First World War had hoped their suffering would prevent future catastrophe. Instead, they saw their children facing hunger, fear, and new wars on the horizon. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Into this void poured ideologies that offered certainty. Fascism promised strength and unity. Communism promised equality and revolution. Militarism promised conquest and pride. And democracy, with all its compromises and arguments, looked fragile and slow. By the end of the decade, the crisis had redrawn the global map of power. Fascism ruled in Italy and Germany. Militarism dominated Japan. Communism hardened under Stalin. Democracies wavered, uncertain and hesitant. The League of Nations, meant to safeguard peace, was a hollow shell. The world in crisis was moving toward confrontation. The dictators had risen, tested their strength, and found their enemies reluctant. The storm was coming. It was only a matter of time before the crisis turned to catastrophe. Testing the boundaries. By the mid-1930s, the world had entered a dangerous twilight. The old order built after the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles, the League of Nations, the dream of collective security, was crumbling piece by piece. The dictators who had risen out of the decade's despair were no longer content to consolidate power at home. They were beginning to probe, to test, to see how far they could push before anyone stopped them. Each step forward was bold, each violation deliberate, and each went largely unpunished. It was in this atmosphere of hesitation and appeasement that the path to global war was paved. Germany was the most obvious flashpoint. The Treaty of Versailles had shackled it with strict military limits. No more than 100,000 soldiers, no tanks, no air force, no submarines. But to Adolf Hitler, those restrictions were chains that had to be broken. In 1935, he announced open rearmament. Factories that had once built automobiles now produced tanks. Airfields sprang up where only fields had stood. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, was created almost overnight. Military parades filled the streets of Nuremberg and Berlin with a confidence that defied the victors of 1918. The world watched, protested mildly, and did nothing. Britain and France, still weakened by the Depression and haunted by the memory of trench warfare, hesitated. Some even argued that Germany had a right to rearm, that the restrictions had been too harsh, and so, what had been written as iron law in 1919 dissolved into empty words by 1935. Hitler had tested the boundaries and found them pliable. The following year, 1936, he struck again. The Rhineland, that vital industrial strip along the French border, had been declared demilitarized by Versailles. It was meant to be a buffer zone, a guarantee of French security. But on March 7th, 1936, Hitler sent German troops marching into it. It was a gamble of enormous proportions. German generals warned him that if France responded with force, the lightly armed units would be forced to retreat, humiliating the regime and perhaps even toppling it. But Hitler understood something his enemies had not yet accepted. Fear and hesitation were his greatest allies. French forces, vastly stronger than the Germans, did not move. Britain counselled caution. The League of Nations issued statements, but no action. Hitler's troops marched unopposed through cities that cheered their arrival. The gamble had paid off. The Versailles settlement was crumbling before the eyes of the world, undone not by negotiation but by bold defiance. While Germany tested Europe, Italy looked south. Benito Mussolini dreamed of empire, of reviving the glories of Rome. In 1935, his armies invaded Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa. The attack was brutal. Poison gas dropped from planes, civilians machine-gunned, villages burned. The Ethiopian Emperor, Haile Selassie, pleaded before the League of Nations, his voice echoing in the chamber. "It is us today. It will be you tomorrow." His warning was prophetic. But the League did little. Sanctions were imposed, but half-hearted. Britain and France, fearful of driving Mussolini into Hitler's arms, avoided strong action. Ethiopia was conquered, and Italy declared itself an empire. The lesson was clear. Aggression worked. International condemnation was no match for tanks, planes, and the will to use them. The same year saw another sign of crumbling order, this one in Spain. The Spanish Republic, established in 1931, was fragile, torn between conservatives, liberals, and radicals. In July 1936, a military uprising led by General Francisco Franco plunged the country into civil war. What might have remained a domestic struggle quickly became a global rehearsal for the next world conflict. Germany and Italy rushed to support Franco's nationalists, sending troops, aircraft, and weapons. Hitler saw Spain as a testing ground, a laboratory for new tactics. The Luftwaffe's Condor Legion carried out devastating air raids, most infamously on the town of Guernica in 1937, reducing it to rubble and killing hundreds of civilians. The attack shocked the world and inspired Pablo Picasso's haunting painting, Guernica, a scream of anguish in black and white. On the other side, the Soviet Union backed the Republican government, sending weapons and advisors. Volunteers from across the world, writers, workers, students, joined the international brigades, fighting in defense of democracy. Yet despite their courage, the Republicans were divided, plagued by infighting and shortages. Franco, with fascist support, slowly gained ground. By 1939, the Republic fell, and Spain became another dictatorship. The Spanish Civil War was more than a tragedy for Spain. It was a warning. The world had seen modern bombing of civilians, the use of tanks and aircraft in coordination, the brutality of ideological warfare. It was, in many ways, a dress rehearsal for World War II. And yet, again, Britain and France stood aside, refusing to intervene directly, bound by a policy of non-intervention. Dictators had tested the boundaries and discovered that the democracies lacked resolve. In Asia, Japan continued to expand unchecked. After seizing Manchuria in 1931, its armies pushed further into China. In 1937, Japanese troops attacked near the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing, sparking full-scale war. Cities fell one after another. Shanghai endured months of savage fighting. In December, Japanese forces entered Nanjing. What followed became infamous as the Nanjing Massacre. For 6 weeks, soldiers slaughtered civilians, executed prisoners, and committed widespread atrocities. Estimates of the dead range into the hundreds of thousands. The world was horrified, but again, no one intervened. The League of Nations condemned Japan, but Japan had already withdrawn. The United States protested but remained committed to isolation. Britain and France, focused on Europe, did little. China was left to suffer alone. The message was unmistakable. The international order had no teeth. Back in Europe, Hitler continued to push. In 1938, he turned his gaze to Austria. The idea of uniting all Germans in one Reich, Anschluss, had been part of Nazi ideology from the beginning. Austrian Nazis, encouraged by Berlin, agitated for union. In March 1938, Hitler sent troops across the border. There was no battle, no resistance. Crowds in Vienna cheered wildly, throwing flowers at German soldiers. Austria was absorbed into the Reich, in direct violation of Versailles. Britain and France protested, but did not act. Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in London saw it as the inevitable fulfillment of German national aspirations. For Hitler, it was another triumph achieved without firing a shot. But his ambition did not stop there. Next on his list was Czechoslovakia, specifically the Sudetenland, a region with a large ethnic German population. Hitler claimed these Germans were oppressed and demanded their liberation. The Czechoslovak government resisted, supported by treaties with France and the Soviet Union. Europe teetered on the brink of war. In September 1938, leaders gathered in Munich. Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and French Premier Édouard Daladier met to decide Czechoslovakia's fate without Czechoslovakia present. Chamberlain, desperate to avoid war, sought compromise. In the end, the Munich Agreement handed the Sudetenland to Germany. Hitler promised it was his last territorial demand. Chamberlain returned to London declaring peace for our time. Crowds cheered. But it was an illusion. Czechoslovakia lost its defences and was left vulnerable. Within months, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and occupied the rest of the country. It was clear now. Appeasement had failed. The boundaries had been tested, broken, and erased. The world had entered a new phase. By 1939, the dictators had dismantled the Versailles system piece by piece. Germany was rearmed and expanded. Italy had an empire in Africa. Japan controlled vast stretches of China. Spain was under Franco's dictatorship. The League of Nations was a hollow shell, its credibility destroyed. Britain and France clung to hope that appeasement could preserve peace, but the evidence said otherwise. And yet, ordinary people still longed for stability. In London, Parents worried about their children more than about foreign policy. In Paris, men and women still crowded cafes, trying to ignore the storm. In Berlin, some Germans marveled at the jobs and order Hitler had restored, even as others whispered fearfully of arrests and disappearances. In Tokyo, children marched in parades for the emperor, their families quietly anxious about food shortages. Across the globe, life continued, even as the ground beneath civilization trembled. The testing of boundaries in the 1930s was not simply a series of political maneuvers. It was a demonstration of how fragile peace can be when the will to defend it falters. Each act of aggression, unanswered, unpunished, made the next one easier. Each silence from the democracies emboldened the dictators further. By the time Britain and France finally drew a line in the sand, promising to defend Poland in 1939, it was almost too late. The boundaries had already been erased. The next step would not be a test. It would be war, appeasement and betrayal. The world had watched, nervously and uncertainly, as Adolf Hitler dismantled the post-war order step by step. Rearmament in 1935, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936, the Anschluss with Austria in 1938, the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia later that same year. Each act was a violation of Versailles. Each was a gamble, and each time the gamble paid off. The dictators had learned a dangerous truth. Their opponents were unwilling to fight. In London and Paris, the word of the decade was appeasement, the belief that peace could be preserved by giving aggressors some of what they wanted. It was a policy born of fear, of memory, of exhaustion, and of hope. But in the end, appeasement was also a betrayal of treaties, of allies, and of millions of ordinary people whose lives would soon be consumed by war. The roots of appeasement lay deep in the trauma of the First World War. For Britain and France, the memory of 1914-1918 was not a distant echo, it was a fresh scar. Almost every family had lost someone. Rows of graves stretched across northern France, silent witnesses to a generation's sacrifice. The idea of plunging once again into a continental war was unthinkable for many. Never again was not just a slogan, it was a national instinct. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain embodied this instinct. A quiet, serious man, Chamberlain was no firebrand. He believed deeply that compromise and diplomacy could preserve peace. He was not blind to Hitler's aggression, but he believed that many of Germany's grievances were legitimate. The Treaty of Versailles, after all, had been harsh. Why not allow Germany to revise it peacefully? Why not satisfy its reasonable demands and thereby avoid another catastrophe? In France, the mood was similar, though tinged with greater anxiety. The Maginot Line, a vast series of fortifications along the German border, symbolized both determination and fear. France had bled more than any other Western power in the Great War. Its countryside was scarred, its population smaller and older, its morale fragile. Many French leaders feared that without British support they could not resist Germany, and so they too leaned toward compromise, hoping to buy time, to build alliances, to avoid the abyss. Appeasement was not born solely of fear. It was also shaped by practical weakness. In the mid-1930s, Britain's military was unprepared for a major war. Its army was small, its air force still modernizing, its navy stretched across an empire. France had a larger army, but its political divisions made decisive action difficult. Both nations were still struggling with the economic aftershocks of the Great Depression. Rearmament was underway, but slow. Leaders told themselves that time was needed, that every year bought through diplomacy was a year gained for strengthening defences. But Hitler was not wasting time either. Germany's factories churned out weapons at a pace unseen since 1914. Tanks rolled off assembly lines. The Luftwaffe expanded with hundreds of modern aircraft. By the late 1930s, Germany was not just breaking the Versailles restrictions, it was preparing for total war. The first great test of appeasement came with Austria. The Anschluss of March 1938 was greeted in Vienna with cheering crowds. To many outside observers, it seemed almost voluntary. After all, were not Austrians Germans too? Why should they not unite with their neighbour? Britain and France protested but did nothing. Chamberlain himself later admitted that few in Britain were prepared to fight to preserve Austrian independence. Hitler had taken another step, and the democracies had blinked. But the true crisis of appeasement erupted later that same year over Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia had been created in 1919 as part of the Versailles settlement, a patchwork nation of Czechs, Slovaks, Germans, Hungarians and others. Its western region, the Sudetenland, was home to more than 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler claimed they were oppressed, discriminated against, denied their rightful place in the Reich. In reality, Czechoslovakia was one of the most stable democracies in Eastern Europe, with protections for minorities and a strong economy. But it also had something else: formidable defences. The Sudetenland contained the mountains and fortifications that shielded the country. To lose it was to lose security. In September 1938, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. He threatened war if his demands were not met. Europe teetered on the edge of conflict. France was bound by treaty to defend Czechoslovakia. The Soviet Union, too, promised support. Britain was not bound, but its influence was immense. The world looked to Chamberlain. Chamberlain believed war could still be avoided. He flew to Germany 3 times in as many weeks to meet Hitler face to face. In Berchtesgaden, in Bad Godesberg, and finally in Munich, he sought compromise. Each time, Hitler raised the stakes. At first, he demanded autonomy for the Sudeten Germans, then outright annexation, then even more. But Chamberlain persisted. He believed, genuinely, that Hitler could be reasoned with, that if Germany's legitimate grievances were met, Hitler's appetite would be satisfied. On September 29th, 1938, leaders gathered in Munich. Hitler, Mussolini, Chamberlain, and French Premier Édouard Daladier. The Czechoslovak government was not even invited. Inside smoke-filled rooms, the fate of a nation was decided. By the end of the conference, the Munich Agreement was signed. The Sudetenland would be ceded to Germany. In return, Hitler pledged that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned to London waving the agreement in his hand. Outside Downing Street, crowds cheered. "I believe it is peace for our time," he declared. For many, it was a moment of relief, even triumph. War had been averted. The nightmare of 1914 would not repeat, at least, not yet. But not everyone was convinced. In Parliament, Winston Churchill warned that Britain had suffered a total and unmitigated defeat. By sacrificing Czechoslovakia, he argued, the democracies had not preserved peace. They had betrayed an ally and emboldened a tyrant. Time would prove him right. For the Czechoslovaks, Munich was a disaster. Their defences, their mountains, their fortifications all surrendered without a shot. Their sovereignty had been compromised without their consent. Betrayal hung in the air like smoke. President Edvard Beneš resigned, broken. Ordinary citizens watched German troops march into the Sudetenland and knew their nation was doomed. Within months, in March 1939, Hitler broke his promise entirely. German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, seizing Prague. This was no longer about ethnic Germans, no longer about Versailles. It was conquest, plain and simple. The mask was off. Hitler could not be appeased. The betrayal of Czechoslovakia was not the only price of appeasement. It sent a signal to the world. To Stalin, it proved that Britain and France could not be trusted to confront aggression. To Hitler, it confirmed that boldness would be rewarded. To smaller nations in Eastern Europe, it demonstrated that treaties and promises were fragile shields against the storm. Appeasement also had a profound psychological effect. In Germany, Hitler's prestige soared. He had taken Austria and the Sudetenland without firing a shot. Crowds hailed him as a genius, a leader who delivered victory through willpower alone. In Britain, Chamberlain's reputation was mixed. Many still praised him for avoiding war. Others began to see that his concessions had only delayed the inevitable. In France, morale sank. The army was strong, but its leaders lacked confidence. The people, weary and divided, doubted their government's ability to protect them. Why, then, did Britain and France cling to appeasement? The answer lies partly in fear, partly in weakness, and partly in hope. Fear of repeating the slaughter of 1914, 1918. Generals still remembered Verdun and the Somme, where hundreds of thousands died for a few miles of ground. Politicians knew their citizens would not easily accept another war. Weakness. Both nations were still rearming, still recovering from the Depression. The RAF was expanding but not yet ready. The French army was strong on paper but demoralized in spirit. Leaders calculated that time was needed, and appeasement seemed to buy it. Hope. The hope that Hitler was not the monster some claimed, that he would stop once his grievances were addressed. The hope that Mussolini might still be persuaded to act as a mediator. The hope that the world could step back from the brink. These were not foolish hopes. They were human hopes, born of exhaustion and trauma. But they were also illusions. The betrayal of Czechoslovakia marked the death of appeasement as policy. When Hitler marched into Prague in March 1939, even Chamberlain understood the truth. Germany's ambitions could not be satisfied by compromise. From that point onward, Britain and France began to draw harder lines. Guarantees were given to Poland. If Germany invaded, they would declare war. The appeasers had finally become defenders. But by then, it was too late to prevent catastrophe. Appeasement remains one of the most debated policies in history. Some argue it was cowardice, weakness, a shameful betrayal. Others argue it was a rational attempt to buy time, to delay war until rearmament was complete. Both views contain truth. Appeasement reflected the realities of the 1930s, the scars of the Great War, the weakness of democracies, the fear of communism, the desire for peace at almost any cost. But it also reflected a failure to see Hitler for what he was, a man whose ambitions were limitless, whose promises meant nothing, whose path led only to war. For the millions who lived through those years, appeasement was not an abstract debate. It was lived experience. For Austrians who watched German troops march into Vienna, for Czechoslovaks who saw their country carved up without their consent, for Ethiopians who endured poison gas under Mussolini's planes, for Chinese civilians massacred in Nanjing, appeasement was betrayal. It meant their suffering was ignored, their independence sacrificed, their lives expendable in the name of peace that never came. And yet, for the parents in London who remembered sons lost in the trenches, for the French farmers who still ploughed fields littered with bones, for the American families burying their heads in isolation, appeasement felt like the only sane choice. That was the tragedy. Appeasement was not born of malice, but of fear. It was a desperate attempt to avoid the abyss. But in trying to avoid war, it made war inevitable. By 1939, the boundaries had been tested, appeasement had been tried, betrayal had been committed. The dictators had won every gamble. The democracies had lost every confrontation. The world had stumbled from crisis to crisis, always choosing compromise, always hoping the storm would pass. But storms do not pass when ignored. They break. And this one was about to break in fire and fury. The age of appeasement was ending. The age of total war was about to begin. The road to war. By the spring of 1939, the fragile dream of peace had collapsed. The old policy of appeasement lay in ruins, shattered in Prague when German troops occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was no longer possible to pretend that Hitler sought only to revise the injustices of Versailles. or that his ambitions could be satisfied with concessions. He had shown the world his true hand. This was a man bent on domination, not negotiation. Europe was on a collision course with war. The only question left was when and where the first blow would fall. The warning signs had been there for years. Hitler's speeches thundered with promises of expansion, Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. He dreamed of an empire stretching eastward, conquering the lands of Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. The Slavic peoples, he declared, were inferior. Their lands should serve as fields and factories for German settlers. His ideology was not merely political but racial, steeped in a poisonous vision of supremacy. What Versailles had denied, what the First World War had failed to achieve, Hitler intended to grasp with ruthless determination. Yet for many outside Germany, his words seemed distant, almost unreal. Could any modern leader truly mean such things? Surely, they thought, these were exaggerations for domestic consumption. Surely, reason would prevail. But the occupation of Prague in March 1939 silenced such illusions. Hitler had crossed the line from grievance to naked aggression. The immediate target of his ambition was Poland. The Polish state, reborn in 1919 after more than a century of partition, occupied land that Germany considered its own. The Polish Corridor, a strip of territory granting Poland access to the Baltic Sea, separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The city of Danzig, predominantly German in population, was under League of Nations protection but coveted by the Reich. Hitler demanded their return. But Poland was not Czechoslovakia. Its leaders were determined to resist. They remembered all too well the partitions of the past, when Poland had been erased from the map by its neighbours. They were not prepared to surrender land without a fight. And this time, unlike in 1938, Britain and France stepped forward. On March 31st, 1939, Chamberlain announced to Parliament that Britain would guarantee Poland's independence. France issued a similar pledge. If Germany invaded, they would declare war. The line in the sand had finally been drawn. The guarantee to Poland marked a dramatic shift. For years, Britain and France had tried to avoid confrontation, hoping to contain Hitler through compromise. Now they acknowledged that war was likely. Both accelerated rearmament. In Britain, factories produced Spitfires and Hurricanes at a frantic pace. Children practiced air raid drills in schools. Gas masks were distributed to millions of civilians. In France, military preparations intensified, though morale remained shaky. Across Europe, the atmosphere grew tense. Hitler, however, was undeterred. In private, he raged at Britain's guarantee. He believed the Western powers were bluffing, that they would never risk their own blood for Poland. He had been right so many times before, in the Rhineland, in Austria, in Czechoslovakia. Why should this time be different? Still, he recognized the risk of a two-front war. To conquer Poland, he needed to neutralize the Soviet Union. This led to one of the most astonishing and cynical deals of the century, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. For years, Hitler and Stalin had denounced each other as mortal enemies. Nazism and communism were ideological opposites. Yet in August 1939, their foreign ministers Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov signed a treaty of non-aggression. Publicly, it was a simple agreement. Germany and the Soviet Union pledged not to fight each other. Privately, secret protocols carved Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be divided between them. The Baltic states and Finland were marked for Soviet control. The world was stunned. Anti-fascists and communists alike reeled at the news. But for Hitler, it was a masterstroke. With the Soviets neutralized, he could attack Poland without fear of encirclement. For Stalin, it bought time. The Soviet Union was not ready for war. Its army had been gutted by purges. By signing the pact, Stalin gained breathing room and territory. It was a cold calculation, and millions would soon pay the price. Meanwhile, ordinary people sensed what was coming. In Britain, newspapers carried ominous headlines. Families built makeshift shelters in their gardens. In Germany, propaganda boasted of unity and strength, but many feared another war. Veterans of 1914 whispered grim warnings. In Poland, the army mobilized, though its equipment was outdated compared to Germany's modern tanks and aircraft. In the Soviet Union, citizens were kept in the dark, told little of the secret deal that would soon redraw their borders. Across the globe, anxiety grew. The summer of 1939 was one of uneasy waiting. Diplomats rushed between capitals, seeking last-minute compromises. Chamberlain still hoped for a negotiated settlement, though his faith in Hitler was shattered. In France, leaders debated strategy, haunted by memories of 1914. In Berlin, Hitler grew impatient. He had set a date for invasion September 1st, but then delayed, gauging the reactions of his enemies. He hoped to divide them, to find a way to isolate Poland as he had Czechoslovakia, but the guarantees to Poland held firm. On August 31st, 1939, Hitler staged one final deception. German operatives, dressed in Polish uniforms, attacked a radio station at Gliwice near the border. They broadcast a short message in Polish, then left behind corpses concentration camp prisoners murdered and disguised as Polish soldiers. It was a crude fabrication designed to create the illusion of Polish aggression. Few outside Germany were fooled, but it provided Hitler with the pretext he wanted. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, German forces crossed the Polish frontier. Tanks rolled across the fields, aircraft roared overhead, infantry surged forward. The Blitzkrieg lightning war had begun. Within hours, Warsaw was bombed. Civilians fled burning villages. Trains carrying refugees were strafed by Stukas screaming out of the sky. The Polish army fought bravely but was hopelessly outmatched. The world held its breath. Would Britain and France keep their word? For 2 days, they hesitated, sending ultimatums to Berlin. Hitler waited, convinced they would back down. But on September 3rd, Chamberlain addressed the British people by radio. This country is at war with Germany. France followed within hours. The gamble had failed. Hitler had unleashed the Second World War. The road to war had been long and twisted. It had passed through the trenches of the First World War, through the humiliation of Versailles, through the despair of the Great Depression. It had wound through the rise of dictators, the failures of the League of Nations, the betrayals of appeasement. Each stage had brought the world closer to catastrophe, and now, at last, the catastrophe was here. For millions of people, the war was not a distant policy debate. It was the sound of sirens in the night, the sight of bombers overhead, the fear of a knock at the door. It was young men called to fight, women packing hurriedly for evacuation, children clutching gas masks as they boarded trains to the countryside. It was uncertainty, dread, and the knowledge that life would never again be the same. And yet, even as the guns roared in Poland, some still clung to hope. Perhaps the war would be short. Perhaps Hitler would be contained quickly. Perhaps the memories of 1914, 1918 had been exaggerated. Few yet realized the scale of what was to come. The Second World War would not be a repeat of the last, it would be worse, far worse. But on those early days of September 1939, the future was still unwritten. The path forward, cloaked in smoke and uncertainty. What was clear was this: the road to war had ended. The war itself had begun. Blitzkrieg in Poland. The morning of September 1st, 1939, broke with a strange stillness across much of Poland. In villages and towns, families stirred awake. Farmers moved toward their fields, shopkeepers prepared for the day. But then came the sound that would change history. The low, growing hum of aircraft engines, the sudden roar of artillery, and the thunder of marching boots and tank treads grinding forward on the roads. At 4:45 a.m., the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the small Polish garrison at Westerplatte, near Danzig, unleashing the first shots of a war that would engulf the world. By the time the echoes of those opening salvos faded, the Second World War had begun in earnest. What fell upon Poland was not the kind of war Europe remembered from 1914. It was not a slow crawl of armies into trenches, nor a drawn-out siege of attrition. This was something new and terrifying. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The name itself suggested violence of overwhelming speed, and that is exactly what it was. A carefully orchestrated storm of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry moving in ruthless harmony. The goal was not to meet the enemy in grinding battle, but to paralyze them before they could react. The Polish army, brave and determined though it was, found itself facing a form of warfare for which it was unprepared, a storm that moved too fast to contain and struck too hard to resist. Germany threw its full might into the invasion. More than 1.5 million soldiers surged across the borders, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. They came from 3 directions at once: north from East Prussia, west from Germany proper, and south from Slovakia, encircling their target with frightening precision. Against them stood roughly 1 million Polish soldiers, men who carried in their hearts fierce loyalty to their homeland, but who carried in their hands rifles and equipment that belonged to another era. Poland's air force was courageous but obsolete, its planes no match for the modern Messerschmitt fighters and Stuka dive bombers that screamed through the skies. Tanks were scarce, and communication across the country faltered almost as soon as the invasion began. Geography offered no refuge either, for Poland's flat plains left it exposed, with no mountains or deep rivers to serve as natural fortresses. From the very first hours, the pattern of blitzkrieg revealed itself. Stuka dive bombers shrieked down upon Polish positions, their sirens designed to instill terror as much as to mark their deadly descent. Explosions ripped apart defences and roads. Tanks thrust forward into the chaos, breaking through the front lines and racing deep into the countryside. Motorized infantry followed, consolidating gains before the defenders could regroup. Rail lines were torn up, bridges destroyed, and communication centres bombed, leaving commanders uncertain of where the enemy was or how fast they were moving. Refugees clogging the roads became targets themselves, strafed mercilessly from the skies to spread panic and slow movement. In a matter of days, entire regions were cut off, surrounded, and forced to surrender. And yet, though outmatched in weapons and numbers, the Polish people did not yield easily. At Westerplatte, fewer than 200 defenders withstood days of bombardment and repeated assaults before finally being forced to surrender. In the Battle of Mokra, Polish cavalry brigades, often reduced in legend to a desperate charge with sabres against tanks, in reality used ambushes and anti-tank rifles to destroy dozens of German vehicles and delay their advance. In Warsaw, soldiers and civilians alike dug trenches, built barricades, and prepared for siege with remarkable defiance. The outcome was never in doubt, but the courage displayed in those early weeks was etched into memory as proof that Poland would not go quietly. Still, courage could not overcome the scale of the assault. The German war machine moved too fast, its forces too numerous, its tactics too devastating. The Polish Air Force fought valiantly but was largely destroyed within days. Many planes caught on the ground before they could take off. Tanks and armoured divisions carved through defensive lines, surrounding units before they could withdraw. Within the first 2 weeks, the Polish government was already urging civilians to flee eastward, away from the advancing front. But the East, too, would soon prove no refuge. From the very beginning, civilians bore the brunt of German brutality. The Luftwaffe deliberately targeted towns to create terror, reducing villages to rubble with little strategic value beyond intimidation. Refugees walking the roads with carts and children became victims of strafing runs. German forces carried out executions in towns where resistance was suspected, rounding up civilians for reprisal killings. Jewish communities in particular were singled out for humiliation, forced labor, and early acts of violence that foreshadowed horrors yet to come. Following behind the army came the SS and Gestapo, tasked with identifying and eliminating political leaders, priests, teachers, and intellectuals. The plan was clear: to decapitate Polish society, to destroy not only its army but its culture and spirit. For 2 tense days, Poland fought on while waiting for its allies. Britain and France had guaranteed Poland's independence, promising to respond if Germany invaded. On September 3rd, their ultimatums to Hitler expired. Chamberlain's voice, broadcast by radio, declared to the British people that this country is at war with Germany. Hours later, France followed suit. Crowds in London and Paris reacted with solemn silence. The war had begun, as promised, but in Poland, no help arrived. The Allies, fearful of repeating the slaughter of 1,914, confined themselves to defensive postures along the Maginot Line. While Poland burned, the West remained eerily quiet, a period that would come to be called the Phony War. To those under German attack, it felt like abandonment, and then came the final blow. On September 17th, as German armies pressed from the west and Polish defences struggled to regroup, the Soviet Union invaded from the east. Acting under the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Stalin's forces poured into Polish territory, claiming to protect Ukrainian and Belarusian minorities, but in truth seizing their share of the spoils. For Poland, it was the end. Crushed between 2 giants, its government fled into exile, first to Romania, then to France, and later to Britain. Soldiers who could escape fled as well, regrouping to fight another day, but millions were trapped. In the Soviet zone, tens of thousands of officers and elites were arrested. Many would later be executed in the forests of Katyn. In the German zone, Jewish communities were forced into ghettos, and the machinery of racial persecution began its first grinding movements. For ordinary Poles, occupation meant terror, deprivation, and the loss of freedom for years to come. Warsaw became the symbol of resistance in those weeks. Surrounded, bombed daily, short of food and water, the city endured under constant siege. Civilians joined soldiers to defend their neighborhoods, carrying buckets of water to douse fires sparked by bombs, digging survivors out of rubble, and sheltering the wounded in basements. On September 25th, the Luftwaffe unleashed one of the earliest and largest terror raids of the war, dropping thousands of bombs in a single day, turning entire districts to ash. The city finally surrendered on September 28th, exhausted but unbroken in spirit. Its defenders insisted on calling it not capitulation but a ceasefire, a temporary pause in a fight they intended someday to continue. By early October, organized Polish resistance had collapsed. Germany and the Soviet Union divided the country between them, meeting in symbolic parades to mark their new borders. But Poland's struggle was not over. Underground movements quickly formed, producing secret newspapers, organizing sabotage, and passing intelligence to the Allies. Pilots and soldiers who escaped to Britain would soon prove decisive in the skies over England and on battlefields across Europe. Though defeated on the map, Poland refused to disappear in spirit. Its resistance would become one of the most enduring of the entire war. The conquest of Poland shocked the world, not only for its speed, but for its brutality. In less than 6 weeks, a nation of 35 million had been carved up and subdued. Observers in London, Paris, and Washington studied the campaign with alarm. The old strategies of slow mobilization, of defensive lines, of attrition, had been swept aside by a new kind of war. Blitzkrieg was not invincible, but it was devastating, and it demanded new ways of thinking if it was to be countered. The fall of Poland was not just a tragedy for its people, it was a warning to all of Europe of what was to come. For the Polish people, September 1939 was more than the beginning of a global conflict. It was the start of an occupation that would bring some of the worst suffering ever inflicted on a modern nation. millions would perish in ghettos, camps, and mass executions. Millions more would endure deportation, forced labor, and daily brutality. And yet, even in the darkest days, the memory of Westerplatte, of Mokra, of the siege of Warsaw reminded them, and the world, that Poland had fought with courage against impossible odds. The invasion was meant to extinguish them. Instead, it lit a flame of defiance that no occupier could fully snuff out. The Blitzkrieg in Poland was the opening chapter of the Second World War, a storm that revealed the shape of things to come. It showed that Hitler's ambitions were boundless, that his promises meant nothing, that his war was not one of limited aims but of conquest and destruction. It showed that Stalin too was willing to bargain in the currency of nations, trading human lives for spheres of influence. It showed that the democracies, though finally roused to action, were still hesitant, still trapped in the fears of the last war. Above all, it showed that the cost of hesitation and appeasement was measured in the suffering of those who stood alone when the storm arrived. By the time the smoke cleared and the last Polish units laid down their arms, Europe had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The war was no longer a question of if. It was reality, and it would spread across continents, oceans, and skies. The invasion of Poland was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. And though the world did not yet know it, the horrors witnessed in September 1939 were only a prelude to far darker chapters yet to be written. The fall of France. The conquest of Poland had stunned the world with its speed, but for many in Britain and France, the months that followed felt strangely quiet. After the declarations of war in September 1939, the Western Front settled into a tense stillness. French troops manned their defences behind the formidable Maginot Line. British soldiers of the newly arrived expeditionary force dug trenches and strung barbed wire in Belgium and northern France. Patrols traded occasional shots with the enemy, but there were no great offensives, no mass battles. Newspapers called it the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war. To others, it became the funny war. People wondered whether the storm would pass, whether Hitler had already gained all he wanted. But in Berlin, plans were taking shape for an offensive that would crush those illusions and plunge Western Europe into catastrophe. For Hitler, the conquest of France was not simply another campaign. It was a dream rooted in vengeance. The memory of Germany's defeat in 1918 haunted him. He had lived the humiliation of surrender, the bitterness of Versailles, and he longed to avenge the Reich by humiliating France in turn. Beyond revenge lay strategy. France and Britain were Germany's only serious opponents in the West. To prepare for his greater ambition, the conquest of the Soviet Union, he needed them neutralized. Only by breaking France could he secure his western flank and free his armies to march east. The German High Command at first considered repeating the strategy of 1914, a massive thrust through Belgium into northern France, bypassing the strongest French fortifications. But one officer, General Erich von Manstein, proposed something bolder. Instead of attacking where the Allies expected, he suggested striking through the Ardennes, a forested, hilly region of Belgium and Luxembourg that French planners considered impassable for tanks. If Germany could push armour through that terrain, they could break into the open plains of northern France, cut off the British and French armies in Belgium, and race to the sea. Hitler seized upon the idea. The plan was daring, risky, but if it worked, it would deliver a victory greater than any Germany had achieved in the Great War. On May 10th, 1940, the storm finally broke. German troops surged into the Low Countries. The attack began with airborne assaults in the Netherlands, where paratroopers seized bridges and airfields in lightning strikes. Bombers roared overhead, devastating Rotterdam in a single day of fire and smoke. The Dutch army resisted fiercely but was overwhelmed. Within 5 days, the Netherlands surrendered, its cities scarred by flames and rubble. Belgium too was attacked, its defences collapsing under the weight of German armour. Civilians fled in panic, clogging roads with carts, bicycles and cars piled with whatever possessions could be carried. The highways became rivers of humanity, moving west as German tanks pressed relentlessly forward. As the Germans invaded Belgium, the Allies moved as expected. British and French armies marched north to meet them, deploying to positions along the Dyle River. It was exactly what Hitler wanted. The main Allied strength had been lured into Belgium, leaving the Ardennes weakly defended. There, in the thick forests and winding valleys, the true German blow was about to fall. Columns of tanks and mechanized infantry pushed through the Ardennes with astonishing speed. Engineers cleared obstacles, built bridges, and directed traffic with ruthless efficiency. For days, long convoys of armour and trucks rolled forward, engines grumbling through narrow forest roads. To the French, the Ardennes was a natural barrier. To the Germans, it became a highway. On May 13th, they reached the Meuse River at Sedan. There, they unleashed a bombardment unlike anything the French defenders had faced. Hundreds of aircraft dove again and again, their bombs obliterating bunkers and trench lines, while artillery thundered from behind. Under this storm of fire, German engineers ferried troops across the river in boats. By evening, a bridgehead had been secured. Within days, tanks were pouring across. The French line, thought impregnable, had been shattered. From Sedan, the German armoured divisions raced westward, driving through the heart of France. Within a week, they reached the English Channel, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and a large portion of the French army in Belgium. The Allies were trapped, their retreat paths severed, their supplies dwindling. What followed became one of the most dramatic evacuations in history, Dunkirk. As German forces pressed toward the coast, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers crowded onto the beaches near Dunkirk, awaiting rescue. Bombers pounded the sand, machine gun fire raked the shore, and fires burned in the distance. Yet a strange hesitation gripped Hitler's command. German armour halted outside the town, giving the British a narrow window. The Royal Navy, assisted by hundreds of civilian boats, fishing vessels, yachts, ferries, crossed the channel again and again, lifting men from the beaches under constant attack. Over 9 days, nearly 340,000 soldiers were evacuated. It was a miracle of survival, but also a disaster. Almost all heavy equipment, tanks and artillery had to be left behind. Britain's army was saved, but barely, stripped of its tools of war. For France, the situation grew desperate. The German advance was relentless. Paris, declared an open city to spare it destruction, fell on June 14th without a fight. German troops marched beneath the Arc de Triomphe, the swastika unfurled from French monuments. It was a sight that stunned the world. Paris, the cultural heart of Europe, occupied by Nazi forces. Just 6 weeks after the offensive began, France collapsed. Its government sought an armistice. On June 22nd, in a railway carriage in Compiègne, the same carriage where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918, Hitler dictated the terms. France would be divided, the north and west under direct German occupation, the south left as a nominally independent regime based in Vichy. Hitler stood in the carriage with satisfaction, savouring revenge. For him, it was the reversal of history, the humiliation of France to match the humiliation of Germany 2 decades before. The fall of France was not simply a military defeat, it was a profound shock to the world. For generations, France had been regarded as one of the great powers of Europe, with a vast army and formidable defences. To see it collapse in 6 weeks against an enemy it had battled for 4 years in the Great War was almost unthinkable. In Britain, the news was received with disbelief and dread. Some in Parliament argued that Britain should seek peace before it too was crushed. But a new leader, Winston Churchill, stood before the Commons and declared that Britain would fight on, alone if necessary. His words, "We shall never surrender," gave voice to the nation's defiance. Across the Channel, with France defeated, the next target lay clear: Britain itself. For the French people, occupation brought division and hardship. In the occupied north, German troops imposed strict controls, seizing resources and enforcing curfews. Jewish families were forced to register, and persecution soon followed. In the south, the Vichy government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, collaborated with the occupiers, enforcing repressive laws and suppressing dissent. Yet resistance also began to stir. In backrooms and mountain hideouts, networks formed to smuggle intelligence, sabotage railways, and keep alive the dream of liberation. For every collaborator, there were those who risked everything to fight in secret. The conquest of France also reshaped the global balance of the war. With Western Europe under German control, Hitler could turn his gaze toward Britain, preparing for invasion. Italy, sensing opportunity, joined the conflict on the Axis side, striking into the Mediterranean and North Africa. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with growing concern. Though still neutral, Americans now saw that the fate of Europe, and perhaps the world, was hanging by a thread. The speed of France's fall also forced militaries everywhere to rethink their assumptions. The Maginot Line, hailed as an unbreakable defense, had been sidestepped in weeks. Armies built for slow, deliberate offensives had been swept aside by mobile, coordinated attacks. Blitzkrieg had proven devastating not only in Poland, but against the most formidable armies of the West. It was not invincible, but it was effective enough to reshape strategy across the globe. Yet beneath the statistics of campaigns and the shifting colours on maps lay the human cost. Millions of civilians fled their homes, pushing carts piled with belongings, leading children and elderly relatives on foot as German planes swooped overhead. Families were separated in the chaos. Farmers returned to find their villages burned. Refugees crowded into towns, only to find food scarce and homes already occupied by soldiers. For them, the fall of France was not measured in armistices and treaties, but in hunger, fear, and the silence of occupation. By the summer of 1940, the map of Europe had been redrawn once again. Germany controlled territory from the Baltic to the Pyrenees. France, the great rival of centuries past, lay subdued. Britain stood alone across the Channel, its army battered, its defences strained, but its will unbroken. The fall of France was a triumph for Hitler, a disaster for the Allies, and a turning point for the world. The war that had begun in the fields of Poland now stretched across a continent, and its future would be decided in the skies over Britain, on the seas of the Atlantic, and eventually in the vast spaces of the East. But in the summer of 1940, one truth was already clear. The world was entering an age of total war, and no nation would be spared its reach. The Battle of Britain. When France fell in June 1940, the world stood in stunned silence. The German Reich, which had been a pariah state just a decade earlier, now ruled almost all of continental Europe. From the Arctic Circle down to the Pyrenees, from the Channel coast to the eastern plains, swastikas flew above government buildings, and German patrols marched through conquered towns. Only one enemy remained unbroken in the West: Britain. For Hitler, Britain's continued resistance was an obstacle and a puzzle. He had admired the British Empire, imagining it as a kindred power with whom Germany might share the world. Perhaps, he believed, they might be persuaded into peace, leaving Germany free to march east against the Soviet Union. But Winston Churchill, now firmly entrenched as Prime Minister, would hear nothing of it. His speeches thundered with resolve. "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall never surrender." With those words, he bound Britain to defiance. For Hitler, the path became clear. If Britain would not yield, it must be broken. The only way to break it was to invade. The operation was given the code name Seelower Sea Lion. To ferry German troops across the Channel, however, Hitler first needed to control the skies. The Royal Air Force, if left intact, could annihilate invasion barges before they landed. Thus, before any troops could cross, the Luftwaffe would have to destroy the RAF. It was a duel unlike any the world had ever seen before. A battle fought not on land or sea but in the air, with the fate of nations hanging in the balance. In July 1940, the campaign began. German bombers, escorted by sleek Messerschmitt fighters, swept across the Channel to strike radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe possessed numerical superiority, with thousands of planes compared to the RAF's few hundred serviceable fighters. Many in Berlin believed Britain's resistance would crumble in weeks. But the RAF had two great advantages. First was technology. The Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane, the backbone of Britain's fighter command, were fast, agile, and deadly in combat. Though the Hurricane was older, its rugged frame and heavy guns made it a formidable opponent. The Spitfire, sleek and beautiful, could match the Messerschmitt in speed and often surpass it in maneuverability. Second was radar. Britain had pioneered a network of radar stations along its coast, giving early warning of incoming raids. Linked to a centralized command system, radar allowed the RAF to scramble fighters at the right time and place, conserving precious resources. What seemed a small technological edge became, in practice, a revolution in air defense. Day after day, German squadrons swept over southern England, bombing airfields and infrastructure. Day after day, RAF fighters rose to meet them, twisting and turning in deadly dances across the summer skies. Pilots were often young men barely out of their teens, their lives compressed into moments of terror and triumph. They flew multiple sorties a day, returning to base for fuel and ammunition before taking off again. Some never came back. By evening, empty bunks marked the price of the battle. Civilians, too, bore witness. Across Kent, Sussex, and London itself, people looked up to see contrails crisscrossing the sky, the sun flashing on wings as battles raged above their homes. Children playing in fields froze at the sound of sirens. Farmers watched parachutes drifting to the ground, some carrying their countrymen, others their enemies. Fire brigades rushed to douse blazes sparked by falling bombs. Families huddled in cellars as anti-aircraft guns thundered through the night. The war was no longer distant. It was overhead, immediate, and inescapable. The Luftwaffe shifted tactics repeatedly, seeking Britain's breaking point. At first, they targeted coastal defences and shipping, hoping to cut off supplies. Then they struck directly at airfields, seeking to cripple the RAF on the ground. For weeks in August 1940, Britain's fate teetered. Fighter Command lost dozens of planes each day. Pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. Mechanics worked through the night to patch bullet-riddled aircraft, sometimes sending them back into the sky with holes still in their wings. Churchill, watching reports, admitted to his cabinet that Britain's survival rested on the endurance of a few hundred young men. And then came Hitler's fateful mistake. In early September, after a British bombing raid on Berlin, Hitler shifted strategy. Furious, he ordered the Luftwaffe to attack London and other cities in massive raids, seeking to terrorize the population into surrender. This campaign, later called the Blitz, inflicted enormous suffering. Night after night, bombs rained on London. Entire neighbourhoods were reduced to rubble. Fires raged out of control. Civilians crowded into underground stations for shelter, sleeping on platforms as trains roared past. Families emerged each morning to find familiar streets turned to smoking ruins. Yet rather than break morale, the Blitz hardened it. Londoners defiantly gathered in pubs, sang songs in shelters, and painted signs declaring, "We can take it." Aye. Crucially, the shift to city bombing gave the RAF breathing room. Airfields and radar stations were spared the worst of the onslaught. Fighter Command rebuilt its strength, rotated exhausted pilots, and repaired its defences. Losses remained high, but Britain endured. By late September, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The invasion barges assembled along the Channel coast remained unused. Hitler, facing the reality that Britain would not fall easily, postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. Instead, his gaze shifted east, toward the Soviet Union. But Britain had survived. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Nazi Germany. For the first time, Hitler's advance had been stopped. The consequences were immense. Had Britain fallen, the entire course of the war would have shifted. The Atlantic would have been open to German domination, America's ability to supply aid crippled, and the dream of liberation extinguished before it began. That Britain stood alone and held firm changed everything. The cost, however, was heavy. More than 40,000 civilians were killed in the Blitz. Entire cities, Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, were scarred by firestorms. Fighter Command lost hundreds of pilots, many of them irreplaceable veterans. Yet from the struggle came a new legend. Churchill, in a speech to Parliament, declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." The phrase captured the gratitude of a nation to its pilots, the few who had held the line. The battle also transformed Britain's identity. From an island power shaken by appeasement and defeat, it became the last bastion of defiance in Europe. The RAF's resistance inspired occupied nations, sending a signal that Hitler was not invincible. It strengthened ties with the United States, whose sympathy grew as images of bombed cities and brave resistance filled newspapers. For the men who fought in the skies, the experience was seared into memory. Pilots spoke of exhaustion so deep they fell asleep in cockpits, of friendships cut short in moments of flame, of the strange beauty of sunlight on wings even as death hovered close. Survivors carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Many never spoke of them, choosing silence over reliving the terror. Others told their stories so that the world would remember what it meant to fight when everything seemed lost. The Battle of Britain was not only a clash of machines and men, it was a struggle of endurance, of spirit, of national will. When it ended, Britain remained unbroken, bloodied but standing. Across the Channel, the swastika flew over Paris and Brussels, but it did not fly over London. The world, watching from New York, Moscow and Tokyo, saw that Hitler could be resisted. The battle was more than a victory, it was a symbol, a beacon in a world gone dark. In the autumn of 1940, as the nights grew longer and bombs still fell, people in Britain lit candles in windows, gathered around radios, and whispered prayers of thanks. They had endured the storm. And though the war stretched endlessly ahead, though worse horrors still waited, they knew now that they were not defeated. The skies above had seen a battle for civilization itself, and for the first time since the war began, hope had taken flight. The Blitz and the war at home, the roar of engines faded, but the war over Britain was far from finished. The Luftwaffe had failed to crush the Royal Air Force in daylight combat, yet Hitler was not ready to abandon his campaign against the island nation. If Britain could not be conquered by invasion, then perhaps it could be broken by terror. Beginning in September 1940, the German strategy shifted from targeting airfields to striking directly at the heart of Britain's cities. The campaign would last through the winter and into the spring of 1941, leaving entire neighbourhoods in ruins, tens of thousands dead, and millions scarred by fire and loss. History remembers it simply as the Blitz. The name came from the German word Blitzkrieg, lightning war, but here it meant something different. It was not the sudden armoured thrust of tanks across plains, but a relentless rain of bombs from the skies. Almost every night, waves of German bombers droned across the Channel, their engines rumbling like approaching thunder. At first they aimed for docks, rail yards and factories, hoping to cripple industry and transport. But very quickly the line between military and civilian targets blurred. Entire districts of London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Coventry, and countless smaller towns found themselves engulfed in flames. The first great raid on London came on the evening of September 7th, 1940. People in the East End watched in horror as hundreds of bombers swept overhead, dropping incendiaries and high explosives across warehouses, streets and homes. The docks along the Thames erupted in fire. Black smoke rolled upward, turning the sunset red. That night marked the beginning of a new phase of war, one where civilians were no longer merely witnesses but deliberate targets. Londoners soon grew accustomed to the wail of the air raid sirens. At the sound, families grabbed their children and blankets, rushing into shelters. Some sought safety in purpose-built underground bunkers scattered across the city, but space was limited. Many turned to the underground itself. At night, platforms filled with rows of people lying side by side. Children curled up beneath coats, mothers humming lullabies to drown out the drone above. Musicians sometimes played violins or accordions to soothe the restless. The rumble of trains gave way to the deeper rumble of bombs, shaking dust from the ceilings. When morning came, families climbed out to find streets unrecognizable, houses gutted and familiar landmarks reduced to rubble. The Blitz was not confined to London. Coventry, an industrial city in the Midlands, endured one of the most devastating raids in November 1940. In a single night, German bombers destroyed much of the city centre, reducing medieval churches and factories alike to ruins. Fires raged uncontrollably, feeding on timber and fuel, fanned by the cold autumn wind. Survivors stumbled through smoke-filled streets as rescue workers clawed through rubble for the trapped and the dead. The devastation was so complete that the Germans coined a new verb, "konzentrieren," meaning to annihilate a city. Liverpool, vital as a port for Atlantic convoys, became another prime target. Its docks were struck repeatedly, and entire neighbourhoods nearby were flattened. Families fled to the countryside when they could, but many had nowhere to go. Children were evacuated in great waves, clutching small suitcases and gas masks, sent to rural villages or distant relatives. For some, it was a grand adventure. For others, it was a trauma they carried forever, separated from parents without knowing if they would ever return. Through it all, the British government worked to maintain morale. Censorship kept the worst images from dominating newspapers, but the truth was impossible to hide. Instead, propaganda sought to shape how people perceived their suffering. Posters declared, "Keep calm and carry on," a phrase that became emblematic of resilience. Radio broadcasts featured calm voices assuring listeners that victory would come if only they endured. Even King George VI and Queen Elizabeth visited bombed neighbourhoods, walking through ruins, speaking with survivors, their presence a symbol of solidarity. The cost of the Blitz was staggering. Between September 1940 and May 1941, more than 40,000 civilians were killed and hundreds of thousands injured. Nearly 2 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Entire families vanished in an instant when bombs struck shelters or tenements. Yet the German strategy did not achieve its aim. Morale did not collapse. If anything, the shared suffering forged unity. In pubs, in shelters, in queues for rationed food, people found comfort in the knowledge that everyone was enduring the same ordeal. The phrase, "the spirit of the Blitz," became shorthand for courage in adversity, a quiet determination that refused to bend under terror. Daily life in wartime Britain was shaped by more than bombing. Rationing, introduced early in the war, tightened as imports declined under the threat of U-boats. Families learned to make do with powdered eggs, dried milk, and limited meat. Housewives stretched recipes with ingenuity, turning scraps into meals. Dig for Victory campaigns encouraged people to grow vegetables in back gardens, on allotments, even in city parks. Schoolyards sprouted rows of cabbages, flower beds gave way to potatoes. Children learned quickly to weed, water, and harvest, their small efforts part of the national fight. Blackouts transformed the nights. Every window was covered with heavy curtains or black paper to prevent even a sliver of light from guiding enemy bombers. Street lamps were extinguished, car headlights fitted with narrow slits. The result was a darkness so profound that people stumbled into lampposts or fell off curbs. Accidents soared, but the rule was obeyed with grim discipline. The night sky belonged to the enemy, and any careless light could bring disaster. Amid destruction, there was also resilience in culture. Theatres reopened after raids, offering comedies and dramas to audiences hungry for escape. Dance halls filled when electricity was available, couples waltzing as if defying the bombs. Music halls echoed with patriotic songs. Cinema became a vital refuge. Films provided both distraction and inspiration. Newsreels, shown before feature films, carried images of bombed cities but also of brave rescue workers, reinforcing the message that Britain was unbroken. Churchill's leadership was central to sustaining morale. His speeches, broadcast over the BBC, gave people words for their endurance. "Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties," he declared, "and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" To a nation crouching in shelters and digging through rubble, such words became lifelines, reminders that their suffering had meaning, that they were not merely victims but participants in a struggle for civilization itself. The Blitz was not only about Britain's suffering, it was also about survival in the broader war. German bombers diverted resources from attacking airfields and factories, buying the RAF precious time to recover from its losses. The failure to destroy Britain's industrial base allowed Spitfires and Hurricanes to keep rolling off production lines. Radar stations, largely spared, continued to give early warnings. The resilience of ordinary civilians, therefore, was not only symbolic, it was strategic. Their endurance allowed Britain to remain in the fight, a vital base for the eventual liberation of Europe. Even as bombs fell, life went on. Couples married in hastily arranged ceremonies between raids. Babies were born in shelters, greeted by midwives working under lanterns. Letters travelled slowly but steadily, carrying love and news between soldiers abroad and families at home. Schools tried to function despite evacuation and destruction, teachers improvising with chalkboards propped against rubble. For children, the war years were both terrifying and strangely normal. Games played among ruins, stories whispered in shelters, friendships forged in fear. By May 1941, the Blitz began to ease, not because Britain had yielded, but because Germany's focus shifted. Preparations for the invasion of the Soviet Union required planes and resources to be moved east. The bombers that had tormented London and Coventry now turned toward Minsk and Kiev. Britain, though scarred and grieving, had survived. Cities smouldered, families mourned, but the nation remained unbroken. The Blitz left a profound legacy. It taught the world that modern war spared no one. Civilians were as vulnerable as soldiers, cities as much targets as forts. It demonstrated the power of endurance, the ability of ordinary people to resist terror through solidarity and courage. And it revealed that Hitler could not bend Britain to his will, no matter how many bombs fell. For survivors, the memories endured long after the rubble was cleared. The sound of sirens haunted dreams. The smell of smoke clung to recollections of childhood. For some, the war years became defining moments. Tales told to grandchildren about nights in the underground, about firestorms in the East End, about neighbours lost and found again in the chaos. The scars on cities became part of their identity, reminders of resilience. In the grand sweep of history, the Blitz was only one chapter in the Second World War. Yet it was decisive. By failing to crush Britain, Hitler left a free nation standing in Western Europe, a rallying point for resistance, a base for future counterattacks. Without Britain, there could have been no D-Day, no liberation of France, no ultimate Allied victory. The endurance of a people under fire had global consequences. As spring blossomed in 1941 and the bombers turned eastward, Britain emerged battered but alive. The fires had been quenched, the rubble slowly cleared, the shelters emptied for now. Children once again played in schoolyards, couples strolled along the Thames, churches rang bells for Sunday services. But beneath the return of daily life lay a quiet pride. They had been tested in fire and had not been broken. The Blitz had sought to terrorize and destroy. Instead, it had forged unity, courage, and the will to fight on. The Battle of the Atlantic. While bombs fell on London and Coventry, another battle unfolded far from the eyes of most civilians. A battle without front lines or monuments, fought on the endless grey waters of the Atlantic Ocean. It was a struggle, measured not in territory captured, but in ships sunk, in convoys protected or lost, in the silent disappearance of vessels swallowed by the sea. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War, lasting from 1939 until 1945, and its outcome determined whether Britain could survive at all. For an island nation, the sea was lifeline and shield. Britain imported vast quantities of food, fuel, and raw materials. Its armies abroad depended on supplies carried across oceans. Without convoys bringing grain from Canada, oil from America, and weapons from factories across the Atlantic, Britain would starve and collapse. Hitler understood this. He knew that while the RAF defended the skies, Britain's belly remained exposed on the waves, and so he turned to a weapon that could strike unseen: the submarine, or as the Germans called it, the U-boat. U-boats had already proven their menace in the First World War, but in 1939 they returned with greater speed, better torpedoes, and improved tactics. Operating in wolf packs, groups of submarines coordinated to attack convoys at night, slipping between escort ships to launch torpedoes into the crowded columns of freighters. One moment, sailors were drinking tea in the galley. The next, explosions ripped through steel hulls, flames shot skyward, and cold seawater surged in. Survivors scrambled for lifeboats, praying for rescue while the U-boats slipped silently away into the dark. For merchant sailors, the Atlantic crossing became a gauntlet of terror. Each voyage meant weeks of monotony, punctuated by sudden catastrophe. Convoys stretched across miles, plodding slowly through the waves, every man knowing that beneath the surface lurked hunters. At night, the horizon flickered with explosions as ships were struck. The sea became littered with burning oil, drifting cargo, and the cries of men clinging to wreckage. Rescue ships could not always stop for fear of becoming targets themselves. Many sailors vanished without trace, remembered only in lists of missing vessels. The scale of the struggle was immense. Thousands of merchant ships were sunk, carrying millions of tons of cargo to the ocean floor. Every cargo lost meant fewer tanks, fewer planes, fewer sacks of wheat reaching Britain. Each ton mattered. Each convoy was a battle for survival. And yet, despite the terror, the convoys sailed. Merchant seamen, often civilians with minimal training, braved the Atlantic again and again. They were joined by naval escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and sloops, whose crews faced the constant challenge of locating and destroying an enemy they could rarely see. Sonar, called ASDIC at the time, offered some chance of detection, but U-boats were cunning and elusive. Depth charges were hurled into the water, sending shockwaves through the sea, sometimes striking home, often not. The Atlantic became a graveyard for both hunter and hunted. Technology played a decisive role. Early in the war, U-boats had the advantage, striking with impunity. But over time, Allied innovations turned the tide. Radar grew more sophisticated, capable of spotting periscopes or surfaced submarines at night. Long-range patrol aircraft began to cover the mid-Atlantic air gap, once a safe haven for U-boats. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built rapidly to accompany convoys extended protection further still. High-frequency direction finding, nicknamed Huff Duff, allowed escorts to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions. Each advance narrowed the hunter's advantage. Perhaps the most dramatic breakthrough came from code breaking. In Bletchley Park, a quiet estate in the English countryside, mathematicians and linguists worked tirelessly to crack the German Enigma code. Men like Alan Turing and women of the Women's Royal Naval Service intercepted and deciphered U-boat messages, revealing positions and plans. Their work, cloaked in secrecy for decades, gave convoys a hidden shield, allowing them to avoid ambushes or send reinforcements at critical moments. Many ships survived because of signals deciphered in that quiet, unassuming mansion. Still, victory was not quick. Through 1941 and into 1942, U-boat attacks intensified. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, its coasts became new hunting grounds. German submarines prowled boldly within sight of American beaches, sinking oil tankers that lit the night sky with fire visible from boardwalks. Hundreds of ships went down before American convoys and coastal blackouts finally curtailed the slaughter. Life aboard a U-boat was brutal. Conditions were cramped and foul, air stale with diesel and sweat, bunks shared by men working shifts. Patrols lasted weeks, even months, with little rest and constant danger. When attacked, submariners endured the deafening thunder of depth charges, the creak of hulls under pressure, the terror of leaks and flooding. Casualty rates were appalling by war's end. More than 70% of German submariners were dead, and yet they sailed, driven by duty, by ideology, by the iron discipline of their commanders. For sailors in the merchant navy, life was equally harsh. They endured freezing spray, monotony, seasickness, and sudden death. Pay was low, recognition scarce. Yet without them, no army could march, no bomber fly, no factory run. Churchill later admitted that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only campaign that truly frightened him. A single month of successful U-boat attacks could have strangled Britain, forcing surrender. The fate of the war rested not only in generals' plans or soldiers' bravery, but in the endurance of men hauling cargo across grey waves. By mid-1943, the balance shifted. Allied escort groups grew stronger, equipped with better radar, sonar, and weapons like the forward-firing Hedgehog mortar. Long-range Liberator bombers closed the mid-Atlantic gap, forcing U-boats to face constant threat from above. Convoys became better organized, escorts coordinated, and losses began to drop. In May 1943, often called Black May for the U-boats, Germany lost more submarines than ever before, 41 in a single month. The hunters had become the hunted. From then on, U-boat crews faced dwindling returns. More submarines were launched, new designs tested, but the tide had turned. By late 1944, Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic with relative security. Supplies flowed to Britain in a torrent tanks, aircraft, fuel, food, preparing for the great offensives that would liberate Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic was not glamorous. It had no dramatic landings to photograph, no famous cities captured in triumph. It was a war of attrition, fought in storms and darkness, in fear and endurance. Its heroes were often anonymous. A destroyer captain ramming a submarine, a codebreaker quietly deciphering a signal, a cook on a merchant ship serving meals minutes before torpedoes struck. Together, their efforts kept Britain alive, allowing the island nation to resist until the tide of war turned. The human cost was staggering. More than 30,000 merchant sailors from Britain alone were killed, their bodies lost to the sea. Thousands of naval crewmen perished. German U-boat losses reached over 28,000 men, a death rate higher than almost any other branch of service. The Atlantic became a graveyard without crosses, its only memorial the waves. Yet from that struggle came victory. Britain never starved. Convoys kept sailing. American industry supplied an ocean bridge of weapons and material. The Atlantic lifeline held, and because it held, the Allies could build the armies that would storm Normandy, liberate France, and march into Germany. The Battle of the Atlantic, though fought in silence and shadow, proved as decisive as any battle fought on land. When the war ended, survivors remembered not the glory of conquest, but the endurance of hardship. They spoke of nights staring at dark horizons, of friends lost in sudden flashes of fire, of the endless sound of the sea. For many, the Atlantic remained in their dreams, both as a place of terror and as the stage of their quiet heroism. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just about ships and submarines. It was about the endurance of nations. It was about whether Britain could hold on long enough for the Allies to regroup and strike back. It was about whether the free world could survive the long night of war. And in the end, through courage, technology, and sacrifice, the lifeline held firm. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. By the spring of 1941, Europe lay almost entirely under Hitler's grip. Poland had fallen, Norway and Denmark subdued, France humiliated, and the Balkans forced into submission. Only Britain remained defiant across the Channel, battered but unbroken. Yet in Hitler's mind, Britain was not the ultimate enemy. For him, the true prize, the ultimate battlefield, lay in the east. There stretched the vast plains of the Soviet Union, a land of immense resources, fertile soil, and millions of people he considered racially and ideologically inferior. In his vision of empire, it was to be conquered, colonized, and exploited. Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, became the plan to achieve this goal. It would be the largest military operation in history, a gamble of staggering scale. The seeds of this invasion had been sown years earlier. In Mein Kampf, Hitler had written of Lebensraum, living space for the German people. He saw the fertile lands of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus as essential to sustaining his empire. The destruction of Judeo-Bolshevism, as he called the Soviet regime, was framed not just as a political necessity, but as an ideological crusade. In his mind, defeating the Soviet Union would not only eliminate Germany's greatest continental rival, but also provide the resources to sustain an eternal Reich. Yet only 2 years before, Hitler had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty with Stalin that carved up Eastern Europe. It had allowed Germany to invade Poland without fear of Soviet intervention and brought valuable raw materials from the USSR into the Reich. But the pact was always temporary in Hitler's eyes. Stalin, for his part, distrusted Hitler deeply, yet believed he could buy time to rearm. Both men knew the peace was fragile, but neither expected it to end with the sudden ferocity of June 1941. On June 22nd, 1941, as dawn broke across the eastern horizon, 3 million German soldiers surged across a front stretching nearly 1,800 miles. They were joined by 500,000 troops from Axis allies, Romanians, Hungarians, Finns, and Italians. It was the greatest invasion force ever assembled, supported by 3,500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and 2,000 aircraft. The Soviet border defences, thinly spread and poorly prepared, were caught almost entirely by surprise. The German advance followed the now familiar pattern of blitzkrieg, fast-moving armoured spearheads slicing through lines, supported by relentless airstrikes and followed by infantry divisions to encircle and annihilate pockets of defenders. Entire Soviet armies were trapped within days, surrounded in vast cauldrons from which few escaped. Prisoners marched westward in columns that stretched for miles. Villages were burned, roads clogged with refugees, fields churned to mud under tank tracks. At first, the success was breathtaking. In the opening weeks, the Wehrmacht captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners and advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. The Luftwaffe struck devastating blows, destroying thousands of Soviet planes, many still on the ground. Cities like Minsk and Smolensk fell in quick succession. German officers reported with astonishment the speed and scale of their victories. To them, it seemed that Stalin's regime might collapse before the year's end. But beneath the surface, the campaign was already sowing the seeds of its own failure. The Soviet Union, though stunned, was vast beyond comprehension. Its armies, though mauled, were immense in number. Its people, though terrorized, possessed a resilience forged in decades of hardship, And unlike France or Poland, the Soviet state would not surrender after a few crushing defeats. Instead, it mobilized with astonishing determination, summoning reserves from the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Stalin himself was shaken in the first days. Shocked by the scale of the invasion, he retreated into silence at his dacha outside Moscow. Some in his circle wondered if he had lost his nerve, but within days he returned, addressing the nation on July 3rd in a rare radio broadcast. Calling his people brothers and sisters, he invoked the memory of Russia's long history of invasions from Napoleon to the Mongols and framed the struggle as a patriotic war for survival. It was the beginning of what the Soviets would call the Great Patriotic War, a term that transformed the conflict from one of ideology to one of national existence. The German plan divided the invasion into three main thrusts. Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, seeking to capture the city and link up with Finnish forces. Army Group Center, the most powerful, drove toward Moscow, the political and logistical heart of the Soviet Union. Army Group South struck into Ukraine, aiming for its rich farmland and eventually the oil of the Caucasus. Each advance achieved dramatic gains in the summer of 1941. Kiev, Kharkov, and Smolensk fell. Millions of Soviet soldiers were captured, their fates sealed in grim prison camps where starvation and disease claimed countless lives. Behind the front, the war took on an even darker character. This was no ordinary conquest. Hitler's orders framed it as a war of annihilation. Political commissars of the Red Army were to be executed on capture. Jewish communities were targeted for extermination by SS units known as Einsatzgruppen. They followed the army, rounding up men, women and children, forcing them to dig their own graves before shooting them en masse. Entire villages disappeared in days. The Holocaust, already begun, expanded dramatically in the wake of Barbarossa, entwining genocide with military conquest. Despite these atrocities, Soviet resistance stiffened. In Leningrad, citizens prepared for siege, building defenses, stockpiling food and digging trenches. In Moscow, factories were dismantled and transported eastward, beyond the reach of German bombers, reassembled in the Urals to continue production. Across the countryside, partisans emerged, striking German supply lines, ambushing patrols, and fading back into forests. The vastness of the land itself became a weapon. German supply lines stretched thin, trucks and horses bogged down in mud as autumn rains turned roads into quagmires. By October, German forces approached Moscow. The capital braced for disaster. Civilians dug anti-tank ditches with bare hands. Students joined militias, and thousands prepared to defend their homes street by street. Snow began to fall, the first whispers of the Russian winter that had defeated Napoleon more than a century earlier. The Germans, lacking adequate winter clothing and supplies, pressed forward in bitter cold. Frostbite maimed soldiers as much as bullets. Engines froze, weapons jammed, horses died in droves. Still, German units advanced to within sight of Moscow's outskirts. Some could see the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. Yet here, the tide turned. Soviet reinforcements, drawn from reserves in Siberia and the Far East, arrived just as the Germans reached exhaustion. Stalin had gambled that Japan would not attack from the east, and he was right. Freed from that fear, he moved fresh divisions west. In December 1941, under the command of General Georgy Zhukov, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. Soviet troops, hardened by Siberian winters, surged against the frozen, weary Germans. For the first time, the Wehrmacht was forced into retreat. The dream of a quick victory was shattered. The failure to capture Moscow marked a turning point. Hitler had underestimated the Soviet Union's capacity to endure, its ability to replace lost armies, and the savagery with which it would defend its homeland. The war in the East, meant to be swift, became a war of attrition, fought across endless steppes and forests, in mud, snow, and fire. The scale of casualties was almost unimaginable. By the end of 1941, Millions were dead on both sides, and yet the war was only beginning. Operation Barbarossa was more than a military campaign. It was an ideological crusade and a clash of civilizations. For Hitler, it was the struggle to impose his vision of a racial empire. For the Soviet Union, it was survival itself. The brutality on both sides exceeded anything the world had seen before. Villages burned, cities starved, prisoners perished in camps, and civilians endured horrors beyond comprehension. The Eastern Front became the bloodiest theatre of the entire war, consuming men and material on a scale that dwarfed every other battlefield. As 1941 turned to 1942, neither side had achieved decisive victory. Germany had failed to deliver the knockout blow, but it still held vast swathes of Soviet territory. The Soviet Union had survived the first onslaught, but at staggering cost. Entire armies had been annihilated, cities destroyed, millions dead or displaced. Yet the Soviet state endured, its factories humming far from the front, its soldiers preparing for the long fight ahead. Operation Barbarossa had begun with confidence, with visions of triumph and empire. It ended in stalemate and blood, a frozen battlefield stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, littered with wreckage and corpses. For Germany, it was the beginning of a war it could not easily win, a war of attrition against an enemy too vast, too resilient, too determined. For the Soviet Union, it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last 4 years, a crucible of suffering and endurance that would shape the destiny of nations. The invasion of the Soviet Union was the turning point that defined the Second World War. It opened the Eastern Front, the vast theatre where the majority of the war's blood would be spilled. It transformed the conflict into a total war of annihilation, where victory meant survival and defeat meant extinction. And though 1941 ended without decision, it set the stage for the titanic battles to come. Stalingrad, Kursk, and the long, grueling road to Berlin. The Eastern Front deepens, Stalingrad and the turning tide. The failure to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941 had shaken the myth of German invincibility, but it had not broken Hitler's ambition. For him, the Soviet Union was still the ultimate prize, and the war in the East would decide the fate of the world. As spring returned in 1942, he launched new offensives with renewed determination. This time, his gaze shifted south, toward the rich farmlands of Ukraine and, beyond them, the oil fields of the Caucasus. Oil was the lifeblood of modern war. Without it, tanks would not move, planes would not fly, and factories would grind to a halt. Hitler believed that by seizing Soviet oil, he could fuel the Reich forever and strangle the Red Army's ability to resist. The plan, codenamed Case Blue, began in the summer of 1942. German armies surged forward once again, sweeping through southern Russia with devastating force. They captured Rostov, gateway to the Caucasus, and pressed onward. Yet as they advanced deeper, their lines stretched thinner, their supply chains longer. The Soviet Union, though battered, had learned from the disasters of 1941. Factories had been relocated beyond the Urals, producing tanks, guns, and planes in astonishing numbers. Reserves were mobilized, and the Red Army, though still suffering heavy losses, fought with growing discipline. Amid this vast campaign, one city emerged as the focal point of the struggle: Stalingrad. Lying on the banks of the Volga River, it was not only an industrial hub but also a symbol. Its name, tied to Stalin himself, made it a target Hitler could not resist. To seize Stalingrad would be to strike a blow at the heart of Soviet morale. To defend it became, for Stalin, a matter of pride and survival. Thus began one of the most savage battles in human history. In August 1942, the German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe unleashed a bombardment that reduced much of the city to rubble. Entire districts were flattened. Streets turned into moonscapes of shattered brick and twisted steel. Civilians who had not evacuated huddled in basements, their lives reduced to hiding from falling bombs and scavenging for food. Yet beneath the destruction, the Soviet defenders prepared for a desperate stand. Urban warfare consumed the city. Block by block, house by house, room by room, soldiers fought with grenades, knives, and bayonets. Snipers perched in ruined buildings picked off enemy soldiers one by one. The Volga became both lifeline and graveyard as Soviet boats ferried reinforcements and supplies across under constant fire. Soldiers often stepped ashore only to die within hours, but still they came. Stalin's order was simple. Not a step back. Retreat was forbidden. To many, it meant fighting to the death. For the Germans, the battle became a nightmare. Accustomed to swift campaigns and open maneuver, they found themselves bogged down in rubble where tanks could not move and every ruin concealed defenders. They nicknamed the fighting Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. Men battled for control of single factories, stairwells, even individual rooms. The Red October factory, the tractor factory, the grain elevator, all became epic battlegrounds where survival was measured in yards, casualties mounted, and morale frayed, but Hitler demanded victory at all costs. Winter returned, and with it, the tide began to turn. In November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive. Instead of attacking the city directly, they struck at the weaker Romanian and Hungarian forces guarding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. The plan worked brilliantly. Soviet armies encircled Stalingrad, trapping more than 250,000 Axis troops inside. The hunters had become the hunted. For Paulus and his men, the encirclement was catastrophic. Supplies dwindled rapidly. The Luftwaffe promised an airlift, but it could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Hunger gnawed at soldiers as rations shrank. Horses were slaughtered for food. Men boiled leather for soup. Ammunition ran low, and the wounded lay untreated in freezing cellars. Temperatures plunged, and soldiers wrapped themselves in rags against the bitter cold. The once proud Sixth Army, spearhead of the Wehrmacht, became a starving, desperate mob. Hitler, refusing to accept retreat, ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs. Relief attempts, such as Operation Winter Storm led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, failed to break the encirclement. As the weeks dragged on, the fate of the Sixth Army was sealed. On January 31st, 1943, Paulus surrendered the southern pocket of Stalingrad. 2 days later, the northern pocket fell. Nearly 100,000 survivors marched into captivity, skeletal and frostbitten, many never to return. Of the original army, only a fraction would live to see Germany again. The victory at Stalingrad was more than a battle won. It was a turning point. For the first time, an entire German field army had been annihilated. The aura of invincibility surrounding Hitler's forces was shattered. Across the world, headlines proclaimed the triumph. In occupied Europe, resistance movements drew new hope. In Washington and London, leaders saw that the Red Army was not only surviving but beginning to push back. For the Soviet people, it was proof that the tide could be turned, that sacrifice could yield victory, yet the cost was almost unimaginable. Historians estimate that nearly 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, died in the Stalingrad campaign. Streets ran with blood, factories collapsed into rubble, and the Volga carried bodies downstream. The city itself was almost entirely destroyed, its population decimated. Survivors bore scars that lasted a lifetime, memories of hunger, cold, and endless death. Stalingrad became not just a place but a symbol of endurance amid horror. In the months that followed, the Soviets pressed their advantage. Their armies advanced westward, liberating territory, reclaiming towns once lost. In the summer of 1943, the Germans attempted to regain the initiative at Kursk, launching the largest tank battle in history. But by then, the balance had shifted. Soviet industry outproduced the Reich. Its armies swelled with new recruits, and its commanders learned from hard experience. At Kursk, German armour was smashed, and from then on the Red Army carried the momentum. Stalingrad and Kursk marked the beginning of the end for Germany on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, was now on the defensive, retreating step by step toward its own borders. The Soviet Union, though devastated, was transformed into an unstoppable juggernaut, determined to drive the invader from its soil and beyond. The Eastern Front became a furnace of suffering. Entire villages were erased, millions displaced, famine and disease spreading in the wake of war. Yet amid this destruction, the tide had shifted irreversibly. The Red Army would not stop at Stalingrad or Kursk. It would march westward relentlessly, through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and eventually into Germany itself. The turning tide at Stalingrad was not only a military reversal but a psychological earthquake. For the first time, Hitler's destiny seemed uncertain. For the first time, Stalin's gamble appeared justified. For the first time, the Allies could imagine a future in which Nazi Germany would not rule Europe, but collapse under the weight of its own ambition. The Allied home fronts, total war economies and civilian sacrifice. While armies clashed at Stalingrad, El Alamein, and in the skies above Europe, another kind of war unfolded far from the front lines. It was a war fought in factories, in fields, in kitchens, and in classrooms. It was a war of ration books, of blackouts, of propaganda posters, of endless work shifts, and of quiet, uncelebrated endurance. The home fronts of the Allied nations became as vital to victory as the armies at the front. Without them, the soldiers could not march, the planes could not fly, and the tanks could not roll. The story of the Second World War is not only about generals and battles, it is also about ordinary citizens who turn their daily lives into a battlefield of production, sacrifice, and resilience. From the outset, the Allies understood that this war would demand more than soldiers. The entire economy, every factory, every farm, every shipyard, every school would have to be mobilized. Economists and generals alike spoke of total war, a phrase that meant not just military mobilization but the complete reordering of society. In London and Moscow, in Washington and Ottawa, in Sydney and Delhi, governments asked their citizens to surrender comforts, to labour without rest, and to endure fear and loss for the sake of a distant victory. In Britain, the transformation was immediate. From 1939 onward, rationing became a way of life. Families received books filled with coupons, each one controlling access to essentials: meat, sugar, butter, tea, and clothing. Luxuries vanished from store shelves. Women learned to stretch meals with lentils, carrots, and dried eggs. Housewives swapped recipes for mock goose made from potatoes and oats, or cakes sweetened with carrots instead of sugar. Posters urged, "Waste not, want not, and dig for victory." Lawns became vegetable plots. City parks sprouted rows of cabbages, and even Buckingham Palace converted gardens for food production. Children learned quickly to weed and harvest, their small hands part of a vast national effort to feed a besieged island. Blackouts transformed every night into a new kind of battlefield. From 1939, every window was covered with heavy curtains or painted with dark paint. Street lamps went dark, headlights were shielded, and even cigarettes were cupped in hands to hide their glow. For the government, blackouts were a shield against German bombers. For civilians, they were a stumbling, dangerous ordeal. Accidents multiplied as pedestrians collided in the dark or cars skidded unseen. Yet the rules were obeyed with a discipline born of necessity, for everyone knew that a careless light might guide death from above. Women played a central role in this new home front war. With millions of men in uniform, the labour force shrank, and women filled the gap. They became bus drivers, welders, mechanics, and engineers. In the Women's Land Army, they donned boots and overalls to plough fields, milk cows, and harvest crops. In munitions factories, they worked with dangerous chemicals, their skin sometimes turning yellow from exposure to TNT. They endured long shifts, constant danger, and skepticism from those who doubted their ability. Yet they proved indispensable. The iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter in the United States found her counterpart in Britain, Canada, and Australia, a symbol of female strength and patriotism. Children, too, were drawn into the war. In Britain, millions were evacuated from cities threatened by bombing, sent to the countryside with gas masks slung around their necks and small suitcases clutched in hand. Some found warmth and kindness in rural foster homes. Others endured neglect or cruelty. For many, the evacuation was a trauma never forgotten, a sudden uprooting that left scars of loneliness and fear. Those who remained in cities endured nights in shelters, school days interrupted by raids, and lessons carried out in makeshift classrooms among ruins. Childhood became a mixture of ordinary play and extraordinary danger. Propaganda became the glue that held home fronts together. Governments invested heavily in posters, films, and radio broadcasts designed to inspire, comfort, and cajole. In Britain, posters proclaimed, "Careless talk costs lives," warning against gossip that might aid spies. In the United States, bright-coloured posters urged people to buy war bonds, conserve fuel, and plant victory gardens. In the Soviet Union, propaganda reached epic proportions. Posters depicted the motherland as a strong, grieving woman, calling her sons to defend her. Films and songs glorified sacrifice and endurance. The message was always the same. The war was everyone's responsibility, and victory required unity. Across the Atlantic, the United States underwent an industrial miracle. Before Pearl Harbor, America's factories produced cars, refrigerators, and consumer goods. By 1942, they were producing tanks, bombers, rifles, and ships in quantities the world had never seen. The nation became, in President Roosevelt's words, the arsenal of democracy. Ford's massive Willow Run plant produced B-24 bombers at a rate of 1 per hour. Shipyards launched Liberty ships in days rather than months. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, their bandanas and overalls replacing aprons. The image of Rosie the Riveter, sleeves rolled and muscles flexed, captured the spirit of transformation. The mobilization reshaped American society. Unemployment, still high from the Great Depression, vanished as millions found work in factories and shipyards. African Americans migrated from the rural South to industrial cities in the North and West, seeking jobs and opportunity. Though they faced discrimination and segregation, they also found new strength in the Double V campaign victory abroad against fascism and victory at home against racism. Native Americans, too, contributed. The Navajo code talkers developed an unbreakable code based on their language, which proved vital in the Pacific War. In every corner of American society, the war brought change, opportunity, and challenge. In the Soviet Union, the home front was a crucible of suffering and resilience unlike any other. When German armies invaded in 1941, entire factories were dismantled piece by piece and transported eastward, beyond the reach of Luftwaffe bombers. Thousands of trains carried machinery, workers, and families across the Urals to Siberia. There, in freezing conditions, they were reassembled and production resumed, often in crude wooden sheds. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored 12-hour shifts without heat, food, or rest. Yet from these relocated factories came the tanks, planes, and artillery that sustained the Red Army. Civilians endured unimaginable hardship. In Leningrad, surrounded by German forces for nearly 900 days, the population starved. Bread rations dropped to mere ounces a day. People ate pets, wallpaper paste, and even leather to survive. Thousands died each week, their bodies carted away on sledges through frozen streets. yet the city did not surrender. Its factories continued to produce weapons, its people clung to life, and its symphony orchestra even performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, broadcast to inspire the nation. The siege of Leningrad became one of the most harrowing and heroic episodes of civilian endurance in history. In Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth nations, the home front also transformed. Canadians produced vast amounts of food, weapons, and aircraft. Australian factories built warplanes and ships, while farmers supplied food for Britain and the Pacific. New Zealanders, though far from Europe, contributed manpower and resources. For all these nations, the war reshaped economies and societies, binding them tightly to the Allied cause. Rationing and scarcity affected every home front. In the United States, gasoline and rubber were tightly controlled. Families received ration books with coupons for fuel, meat, sugar, and canned goods. Victory Gardens supplied fresh vegetables, supplementing short supplies. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and paper for recycling drives. Schoolyards and churches held scrap collections, teaching the young that even small efforts mattered. In Britain, clothing was rationed, leading to campaigns for make, do, and mend. Old garments were patched and repurposed, creativity replacing consumption, fashion adapted to austerity, with simple designs and practical fabrics. The war also brought profound changes to daily life. In Britain and Germany alike, people carried gas masks everywhere, fearing chemical attacks. In the United States, air raid drills and blackouts prepared cities for attacks that never came. In the Soviet Union, civilians lived under constant bombardment, their homes destroyed, their families scattered. Across the world, people lived with uncertainty, never knowing when a telegram might arrive announcing the death of a loved one at the front. Entertainment and culture became weapons of morale. Hollywood produced films that glorified the war effort, from patriotic musicals to documentaries. Stars like Humphrey Bogart and Bette Davis promoted war bonds. In Britain, the BBC broadcast news and comedy shows that comforted listeners huddled in shelters. Music provided escape and courage. Vera Lynn's "We'll Meet Again" became an anthem of hope. Her voice carried across airwaves to soldiers and civilians alike. In the Soviet Union, folk songs and stirring marches reminded people of their heritage and resilience. The psychological burden of the home front was immense. Nights spent in shelters, days spent queuing for rations, the constant fear of loss all weighed heavily, yet communities found ways to endure. Neighbors shared food, strangers helped dig out rubble, volunteers staffed hospitals and canteens. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples became centers of comfort. Amid fear and grief, people discovered solidarity. The war accelerated social change. Women's expanded role in the workforce challenged traditional gender roles. Though many were expected to return to domestic life after the war, the memory of independence and capability remained. In the United States, the migration of African Americans into industrial jobs laid foundations for the civil rights movement. In the Soviet Union, the sacrifices of women, children, and elderly citizens became part of national mythology. Across the Commonwealth, the war spurred movements for independence, as colonized peoples questioned why they should fight for freedom abroad while denied it at home. By 1943, the Allied home fronts had achieved a level of mobilization that dwarfed the Axis. American factories outproduced Germany and Japan combined. Soviet industry, despite devastation, churned out tanks and artillery in astonishing numbers. British shipyards and airfields continued to deliver vital convoys and aircraft. The combined weight of these economies, driven by civilian sacrifice, tipped the balance of the war. Yet victory came at a price. The home fronts bore scars that lasted for generations. Bombed-out cities required decades of rebuilding. Families never recovered from the loss of fathers, sons, and daughters. Rationing in Britain continued until the 1950s. In the Soviet Union, famine and devastation lingered. In the United States, returning soldiers faced the challenge of reintegration, while women and minorities fought to preserve gains made during the war. The Allied home fronts remind us that wars are not won only on battlefields. They are won in kitchens where meals were stretched, in factories where women worked until their hands bled, in fields where children harvested crops, in shelters where families endured fear together. They are won through sacrifice, unity, and resilience. The story of the home fronts is a story of quiet heroism, of millions who may never have seen a battlefield but whose endurance was no less vital. They remind us that victory in war is not only about generals and armies, but about entire societies willing to endure hardship for the sake of freedom. By 1944, the fruits of these sacrifices became clear. Allied soldiers landed in Normandy equipped with weapons, vehicles, and supplies that seemed limitless compared to the shrinking resources of the Axis. Soviet offensives surged forward, supported by tanks and artillery built in relocated factories. The tide had turned, and it was the home fronts, those endless hours of labor and sacrifice, that made it possible. When the war finally ended, leaders praised soldiers and generals, but those who had kept the home fires burning also deserved recognition. They had endured fear, hunger, and exhaustion. They had carried burdens silently, without medals or parades, yet their contribution was written in every victory, in every liberated city, in every step toward peace. The Italian campaign and the fall of Mussolini, when the dust of El Alamein settled in North Africa and Rommel's Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, the Mediterranean shifted from being a stalemate to an Allied springboard. The question was, where to strike next? Churchill, eager to open another front and chip away at what he called Europe's soft underbelly, urged an invasion of Italy. The United States, focused on preparing for a future cross-channel invasion into France, hesitated but agreed. Italy was the Axis's weakest partner, its military demoralized, its population weary of war, and its dictator Benito Mussolini losing his grip. If Italy could be knocked out of the war, Germany would stand isolated in Europe, forced to divert troops from the Eastern Front and France. Thus began one of the most grueling and overlooked campaigns of the war, the slow, bloody fight up the Italian peninsula. The first step was Sicily. Operation Husky, launched in July 1943, was the largest amphibious invasion yet attempted, involving British, American, and Canadian forces. Under cover of night, Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines while naval convoys carried divisions towards Sicily's beaches. The landings met stiff resistance but gradually gained ground. Fierce battles raged in the hills and towns of Sicily, with German and Italian forces retreating stubbornly while conducting skilled rearguard actions. The island's rugged terrain favoured the defenders, but Allied superiority in the air and sea proved decisive. As Sicily fell, political tremors shook Italy itself. The Italian people, long suffering from food shortages, bombings and defeats, had grown weary of Mussolini's promises. The fascist Grand Council turned against him, and on July 25, 1943, Mussolini was deposed and arrested by order of King Victor Emmanuel III. Italians poured into the streets celebrating, believing the nightmare might soon be over. Yet Mussolini's fall did not mean immediate peace. The Germans, anticipating betrayal, swiftly moved to occupy Italy, reinforcing defences and preparing to fight on. The Allies next invaded the mainland. On September 3, 1943, British forces crossed from Sicily into Calabria, Italy's toe. A few days later, the main landings took place at Salerno under Operation Avalanche. Here, the Germans under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring were waiting. As Allied troops struggled ashore, German counterattacks threatened to throw them back into the sea. For days the outcome hung in the balance, with bloody street fighting and artillery pounding the beaches. Only with naval gunfire and relentless determination did the Allies secure a foothold. On September 8th, Italy signed an armistice with the Allies, effectively exiting the war. But this did not bring peace to the peninsula. German forces swiftly disarmed Italian troops, occupied much of the country, and rescued Mussolini in a daring commando raid led by Otto Skorzeny. Hitler installed him as leader of the Italian Social Republic, a puppet regime based in northern Italy. The war in Italy was far from over. Instead of liberation, Italians now found themselves trapped between German occupation and Allied invasion. Their land turned into a battlefield. The advance northward proved agonizingly slow. Italy's geography favored the defenders. Mountains, rivers, and narrow valleys provided endless natural fortifications. The Germans constructed strong defensive lines, notably the Gustav Line, anchored at Monte Cassino, where a centuries-old Benedictine monastery crowned a hill commanding the road to Rome. For months, the Allies battered against these defences in one of the most brutal campaigns of the war. The Battle of Monte Cassino epitomised the agony of the Italian campaign. Beginning in January 1944, Allied forces launched repeated assaults on the monastery and surrounding heights. The fighting was savage infantry clawing uphill under machine gun fire, tanks bogged in mud, artillery turning villages into rubble. Believing the Germans had fortified the monastery itself, the Allies bombed it in February, reducing the ancient building to ruins. Ironically, the Germans had not occupied it before the bombing, but afterward, they used the rubble as a near-impenetrable fortress. For months the battle ground on, involving Polish, Indian, New Zealand, French, American and British troops. Thousands died in the mud and ruins. Only in May 1944 did the Allies finally break through, the Polish II Corps planting their flag on the shattered monastery. While Monte Cassino consumed lives, another bold manoeuvre unfolded. In January 1944, the Allies launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio, just south of Rome. The goal was to outflank German defences and speed the advance north. At first, the landing succeeded with little opposition, but Allied commanders hesitated to push inland. This delay allowed Kesselring to rush reinforcements and encircle the beachhead. Fierce fighting ensued as Allied troops found themselves trapped, bombarded and counterattacked. The Battle of Anzio dragged on for months in muddy trenches reminiscent of the First World War. Finally, in May 1944, coordinated offensives broke the deadlock, and Rome fell to the Allies on June 4th, 2 days before D-Day in Normandy. The capture of Rome was a symbolic victory, the first Axis capital liberated. Crowds cheered in the streets, church bells rang, and for a moment the city breathed free. But the war in Italy was far from finished. German forces retreated north, establishing new defensive lines through the Apennine Mountains. The campaign dragged into late 1944 and 1945, with bitter fighting through Florence, Bologna and the Po Valley. Each advance was contested fiercely, each river crossing paid for in blood. For civilians, the Italian campaign was a nightmare. Villages were bombed, towns shelled, and farmland turned into battlefields. Millions were displaced, and hunger stalked the land. Partisan groups rose in the north, sabotaging German supply lines, ambushing convoys, and clashing with fascist loyalists. The resistance movement, fueled by ordinary Italians, became a crucial partner to the Allies, gathering intelligence and tying down German forces. But reprisals were brutal massacres, deportations and executions scarred communities. By spring 1945, the end was near. Allied forces launched a final offensive in April, breaking through the last German lines in the north. Cities fell, one after another. On April 25th, Italian partisans captured Mussolini as he tried to flee towards Switzerland. 2 days later, he was executed. His body hung in Milan as a grim symbol of fascism's collapse. Within days, German forces in Italy surrendered. The Italian campaign had been long, bloody, and often overshadowed by other fronts. Casualties were enormous. Hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or captured on both sides, with civilians suffering terribly. The campaign tied down German divisions that might have fought in France or Russia, draining resources from the Reich. It also revealed the limits of Churchill's soft underbelly. The terrain of Italy proved anything but soft. The mountains turned every mile into a fortress. Yet the campaign achieved its goals. Italy was removed from the Axis, the Mediterranean secured, and Germany stretched thinner and thinner. For the soldiers who fought there, Americans slogging through mud at Anzio, Poles dying on the slopes of Monte Cassino, Indians and Gurkhas scaling cliffs in the Apennines, French North Africans charging through villages, the campaign was unforgettable. For Italians, it was a story of occupation, liberation, and civil war, of suffering and courage, of a nation caught between powers. The fall of Mussolini marked more than the collapse of one dictator. It symbolized the unraveling of fascism in Europe. Once, Mussolini had strutted as Hitler's senior partner, boasting of empire. By 1945, he died, reviled, his body desecrated by his own people. His fate was a warning to tyrants and a signal to the world that the Axis dream of domination was crumbling. D-Day and the liberation of France. By the summer of 1944, the Allies knew that victory in Europe required one thing above all: the liberation of France. Since 1940, the country had been under Nazi occupation, its people enduring censorship, forced labour, and the daily presence of the Gestapo. Resistance fighters risked their lives in sabotage and secret networks, but without an Allied invasion, liberation was impossible. The Soviet Union had been demanding a second front for years to relieve pressure on the Eastern Front. Now, after campaigns in North Africa and Italy, after years of preparation, deception and sacrifice, the Allies were ready. They would storm the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious operation in history. The day was June 6, 1944 D-Day. The planning had been immense. For months, Allied commanders debated where to land. The narrowest point of the English Channel, Pas de Calais, seemed logical, but it was heavily defended. Normandy, farther west, offered wide beaches and weaker defences, though its tides, cliffs and bocage countryside posed difficulties. Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion, required not only military precision but also secrecy. Deception operations, including the famous Operation Fortitude, convinced the Germans that the invasion would come at Calais. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and even a phantom army under General Patton were used to mislead the enemy. The force assembled was staggering. Nearly 7,000 ships gathered in southern England, warships, troop transports, landing craft and supply vessels. Over 150,000 soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations prepared to cross the Channel. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies, ready to provide cover and transport paratroopers. The logistics alone were breathtaking. Food, ammunition, fuel, and equipment for an entire army had to be carried across the sea. Every soldier carried not only a weapon but also the weight of history. The night before the landings, paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines. American airborne divisions, the 82nd and 101st, landed in the darkness near Sainte-Mère-Église, tasked with securing bridges and disrupting German defences. British and Canadian paratroopers dropped near Pegasus Bridge, fighting fierce battles in hedgerows and villages. Many were scattered by wind and anti-aircraft fire, landing far from their objectives. Some drowned in flooded fields, weighed down by gear. Others rallied into small groups, carrying out daring ambushes and holding key crossroads until reinforcements arrived. Their sacrifice sowed confusion among German defenders. At dawn on June 6th, the invasion fleet appeared off Normandy's coast. Warships opened fire, their guns thundering, shaking the sea and sky. Landing craft surged forward, packed with soldiers bracing themselves against fear and waves. The beaches had code names: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold and Sword for the British, and Juno for the Canadians. Each would tell its own story of courage, chaos, and loss. At Utah Beach, fortune favoured the Americans. Strong currents carried the first wave off course, but this mistake placed them in a weaker stretch of defences. They secured the beach quickly, advancing inland with relatively few casualties. At Omaha, however, the story was different. German defences were strongest here: machine gun nests, artillery, barbed wire, and mines. As the ramps of landing craft dropped, soldiers waded into waist-deep water under a storm of bullets and shells. Many were cut down before reaching shore. Bodies littered the surf, tanks sank in the sand, officers fell one after another. For hours it seemed Omaha might be a disaster, yet small groups of survivors crawled forward, blasting gaps in wire, scaling cliffs and silencing bunkers. By sheer grit, Omaha was won, though at a terrible price. Over 2,000 casualties in a single morning. On the British and Canadian beaches Gold, Juno and Sword, the fighting was fierce but progress steady. Engineers cleared obstacles, tanks rolled ashore, and infantry pushed inland through villages. Canadian troops at Juno faced deadly fire, but advanced farther inland than any other force on D-Day. British units captured key towns and linked with paratroopers at Pegasus Bridge, securing the eastern flank. By nightfall, despite heavy losses, 5 beachheads had been established. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's great line of coastal defences, had been breached. The liberation of France, however, was not won in a single day. The Normandy campaign stretched for weeks, grinding through hedgerows, villages and fields. The Bocage countryside, dense hedges and narrow lanes favoured defenders. German forces, including elite panzer divisions, counterattacked fiercely. Villages were reduced to rubble, tanks ambushed at close range, soldiers engaged in bitter hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was slow and costly, with each mile contested. In late June, the Allies captured Cherbourg, securing a crucial port. Yet the real breakout came in July with Operation Cobra, spearheaded by American forces. Thousands of bombers carpet-bombed German positions, blasting gaps in their lines. Infantry and armour surged through, racing across open countryside. German units, worn down by attrition and cut off from supplies, began to collapse. The Allies poured through the breach, encircling tens of thousands of German troops at the Falaise pocket. The road to Paris was open. Paris itself had been under occupation since 1940. The City of Lights, once vibrant, had endured years of rationing, censorship, and fear. The French resistance grew bolder as the Allies advanced, staging uprisings and sabotaging German forces. In August 1944, Parisians rose in open revolt, seizing police stations and barricading streets. The Allies raced to join them. On August 25th, the French 2nd Armoured Division, alongside American units, entered the city. Crowds cheered, church bells rang, and General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, declaring, "Paris liberated." It was one of the most emotional moments of the war, a symbol that Nazi tyranny was breaking. But liberation came at a heavy cost. Normandy's towns and villages lay in ruins, bombed and shelled into rubble. Civilians suffered terribly caught between advancing and retreating armies, bombed from the air, driven from their homes. Tens of thousands were killed in the fighting, and survivors faced the task of rebuilding shattered lives. Yet their sacrifices, alongside those of soldiers, made freedom possible. Strategically, D-Day and the liberation of France changed everything. It gave the Allies a permanent foothold in Western Europe, allowing them to launch offensives into Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately Germany itself. It relieved pressure on the Soviet Union, fulfilling the promise of a second front. It demonstrated the power of Allied cooperation. American industry, British planning, Canadian valour, French resistance, and countless others united in purpose. For the soldiers who fought there, the memories never faded. Some spoke of terror on the beaches, of comrades lost in the surf, of the strange beauty of dawn over the Channel. Others remembered the gratitude of French villagers, offering flowers and wine to dusty, weary liberators. D-Day was both horror and triumph, death and liberation bound together in a single day. The liberation of France did not end the war, but it marked the beginning of the end. Hitler's grip on Western Europe was broken. The Reich faced enemies advancing from west, east and south. Though many battles still lay ahead, the Ardennes, the Rhine, Berlin itself, the tide had turned irreversibly. D-Day and the liberation of France remain etched in memory not only as military feats, but as symbols of hope and unity. They remind us that tyranny, no matter how entrenched, can be overcome when free nations stand together. The beaches of Normandy, once soaked in blood, are today places of pilgrimage, where rows of white crosses face the sea. They stand as silent witnesses to sacrifice, courage, and the enduring belief that freedom is worth any price. The Battle of the Bulge and Germany's last gamble. By late 1944, the Allies seemed unstoppable. France had been liberated, Paris free, and Allied armies were pressing toward the German border. From the east, the Red Army thundered forward, smashing through Eastern Europe and preparing to cross into Germany itself. To many observers, the war looked nearly won. Yet Adolf Hitler, isolated in his headquarters, obsessed with visions of reversing fate, prepared one last desperate stroke. He believed that if Germany could split the Western Allies, sow panic, and recapture the initiative, the war's outcome might change. Out of this dream of reversal came the Ardennes offensive, what the world would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes was a dense forest region stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg, a landscape of pine trees, rolling hills and narrow valleys. It was not an obvious place for a massive German attack. In 1940, German forces had surged through here to surprise France, but by 1944, most Allied planners considered it a quiet sector. Exhausted American divisions were stationed there to rest and refit, manning thin defensive lines with limited heavy weapons. Winter had set in, blanketing the land with snow and fog. To the Allies, it seemed the perfect place for quiet. No one expected Hitler to strike there, but Hitler had chosen it precisely for that reason. His plan, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, aimed to smash through the Ardennes with armoured divisions, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. By doing so, he hoped to cut off the British from the Americans, fracture their alliance, and force a negotiated peace in the West, allowing Germany to turn all its might against the Soviets. It was an audacious plan, fraught with risk. Germany's resources were stretched thin, fuel supplies scarce, and experienced soldiers depleted. Yet Hitler demanded it, and his generals, though doubtful, obeyed. On the morning of December 16th, 1944, the German offensive began. In the freezing pre-dawn darkness, over 200,000 German troops and nearly 1,000 tanks surged forward, supported by a massive artillery barrage. The quiet forest erupted with explosions. American outposts, caught completely off guard, were overrun. Thick fog grounded Allied aircraft, removing their greatest advantage. Panzer divisions, battle-hardened veterans of years of war, drove westward, crushing thin American lines. Confusion reigned. Units were cut off, communications severed. German commandos in American uniforms infiltrated behind the lines, spreading rumors, changing road signs, and sowing chaos. Bridges were captured, villages seized, and American troops forced into desperate retreats. Within days, the German advance punched deep into Allied territory, creating a huge bulge in the front lines, hence the name Battle of the Bulge. For young American soldiers, many new to combat, the attack was a nightmare. At Bastogne, Stringvith, and countless small villages, they fought to delay the German advance. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division rushed in to hold the crossroads, found itself completely surrounded. Cut off from supplies, freezing in foxholes, low on ammunition, they held on grimly. When a German delegation demanded their surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe gave a one-word reply: nuts. It became legendary, a symbol of defiance amid desperation. The weather was as much an enemy as the Germans. Snowstorms blanketed the Ardennes, temperatures plunged below freezing. Soldiers huddled in icy foxholes, their boots soaked, frostbite claiming fingers and toes. White camouflage cloaks blended with the snow, machine guns froze, and vehicles stalled in the cold. Visibility was poor, making ambushes sudden and deadly. Many men later recalled that the cold, hunger, and exhaustion were worse than enemy fire. Yet as days passed, cracks appeared in the German offensive. Fuel shortages plagued their advance without gasoline. Tanks stood idle. American engineers blew bridges and fuel depots, denying resources. Resistance stiffened at key points, slowing momentum. At St. Vith, stubborn defense by outnumbered American units delayed the Germans, crucially disrupting their timetable. Every hour lost weakened Hitler's gamble. By December 23rd, the skies cleared. Allied air power, grounded by fog, roared back to life. Fighters and bombers strafed German convoys, smashed supply lines, and pounded advancing armour. Paratroopers at Bastogne were resupplied from the air. The tide was turning. Then came General George S. Patton's Third Army. With astonishing speed, he pivoted his forces north, marching through snow and ice to relieve Bastogne. By December 26th, Patton's troops broke through, linking with the defenders. Bastogne had held, and with it, the German offensive began to unravel. The fighting, however, continued into January. German forces fought fiercely, unwilling to yield. Villages changed hands multiple times. Forests littered with burned-out tanks and bodies. Casualties mounted on both sides. In the end, over 80,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing the bloodiest battle fought by the US Army in the entire war. German losses were even greater. More than 100,000 men, tanks, and aircraft they could never replace. Strategically, the Battle of the Bulge was catastrophic for Germany. Hitler had gambled his last reserves of armour and manpower on the offensive. Once lost, Germany had nothing left with which to mount major attacks in the west. The road into Germany lay open. In the east, the Soviets prepared their own massive winter offensive, pressing toward Berlin. The dream of dividing the Allies had failed. Yet the battle revealed more than just strategy. It showcased the resilience of ordinary soldiers, the young GIs who dug into frozen ground, the paratroopers who refused surrender, the tank crews who fought on despite overwhelming odds. It also tested Allied unity. Though surprised, the Allies recovered quickly, coordinating reinforcements and air power to counterattack. Far from dividing them, the German offensive strengthened their determination. For civilians in Belgium and Luxembourg, the battle was another chapter of suffering. Villages were bombed, homes destroyed, families displaced in the freezing cold. Many civilians aided the Allies with intelligence or shelter, while others endured reprisals from retreating Germans. Towns like Bastogne, Malmedy, and Houffalize became synonymous with both tragedy and courage. At Malmedy, captured American prisoners were massacred by SS troops, a war crime that shocked the world and steeled Allied resolve. The legacy of the Battle of the Bulge was profound. For the United States, it became a story of endurance, of young men thrown into chaos who stood firm against the last fury of the Reich. For Germany, it marked the end of hope. The offensive drained reserves, leaving the Western Front vulnerable to the Allied advance across the Rhine. For Europe, it was another scar forests filled with graves, villages rebuilt from rubble, memories of a winter of fear. When it was over, survivors spoke of snow-stained red, of silent forests littered with wreckage, of comrades frozen where they fell. They remembered the relief of clear skies, the thunder of Allied planes, the moment Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne. They remembered the word nuts, echoing as a defiant joke in the face of death. And they remembered that in the coldest winter, when the outcome seemed uncertain, determination had carried them through. The Battle of the Bulge was Hitler's last gamble, his final attempt to change the course of the war in the West. It failed, and with it failed the last illusions of Nazi victory. From that snowy forest, the path led only one way, into Germany, across the Rhine, and ultimately to Berlin. The Reich was doomed, and the world moved toward the final bloody climax of the war in Europe, the fall of Berlin and the collapse of the Reich. By early 1945, the German Reich stood on the edge of destruction. From the west, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and were pushing into the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. From the east, the Red Army thundered toward the Oder River, just miles from Berlin. Cities lay in ruins, transport was collapsing, and German civilians fled in endless columns of refugees before advancing armies. The 1,000-year Reich that Adolf Hitler had promised was disintegrating after only 12 years, and its final act would play out in the streets and bunkers of Berlin. The story of Berlin's fall is not simply one of military maneuvers. It is the tale of a nation in collapse, of civilians caught in the storm, of soldiers fighting hopelessly, and of leaders clinging to delusion. It is a story of vengeance and justice, of fire and ruin, and of an ending that would define the century. Hitler, increasingly isolated in his Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, refused to face reality. He issued orders to divisions that no longer existed, commanded counterattacks from units shattered weeks earlier, and raged against generals he accused of betrayal. His inner circle, stripped of hope, continued to obey or cower. Around him, the bunker filled with secretaries, officers, and aides who lived in a twilight world of flickering lights, stale air, and the distant rumble of artillery growing louder by the day. Meanwhile, Berlin prepared if such a word could be used for its fate. The city that once boasted of grand boulevards, theatres and monuments was already scarred by years of Allied bombing. Entire neighbourhoods lay in rubble. Water and power were sporadic. Food was scarce. Yet now, with the Soviets closing in, the Nazi regime demanded more sacrifice. Old men and young boys were conscripted into the Volkssturm, a people's militia armed with rifles from another era, or even Panzerfausts with little training. Hitler Youth members, barely teenagers, were ordered to hold street corners. Civilians dug trenches and erected barricades, knowing they faced the most experienced and ruthless army in the world. On April 16th, 1945, the final Soviet offensive began. Along the Oder River, Marshal Georgy Zhukov unleashed one of the greatest artillery barrages in history. Thousands of guns thundered at once, shaking the earth for miles. The Red Army surged forward, their objective clear: Berlin. Resistance was fierce at Seelow Heights, the last natural barrier before the city. German defenders fought desperately, inflicting heavy casualties, but the Soviet tide was unstoppable. Within days, Soviet forces poured across the river and pressed westward. Other Soviet armies swung from the south, encircling the capital. By April 25th, Berlin was surrounded. The noose tightened, and inside, more than 2 million civilians braced for the storm. The battle for Berlin was unlike any other. Street by street, house by house, Soviet soldiers advanced. Tanks rolled through avenues, their guns blasting buildings into rubble. Snipers lurked in windows. Machine guns rattled from cellars. The Germans turned every intersection into a fortress, using rubble as barricades, mines in sewers, flamethrowers in alleys. For the Red Army, hardened by years of brutal combat at Stalingrad, Kursk and Leningrad, this was the final reckoning. Many sought vengeance for atrocities committed in their homeland. Civilians suffered terribly. Women feared the violence that swept with the conquering troops. Families huddled in basements, hoping to survive bombardment and assault. Fires consumed block after block until the city glowed red against the night sky. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler's world shrank. Reports arrived hourly of lost districts, broken divisions, and betrayal. He raged at generals, sacked commanders, and cursed his own people for failing him. Yet he refused to leave Berlin, declaring he would die in the capital. His companions Eva Braun, who had been his mistress for years, secretaries who still typed his orders, and ministers who clung to power, lived in an atmosphere of surreal denial. Meals were eaten while shells shook the walls. Marriages were performed as artillery thundered overhead. In one final gesture of loyalty, Hitler married Eva Braun on April 29th. The following day, with Soviet troops only blocks away, he dictated his political testament, blaming Jews for the war, condemning his generals, and urging Germans to fight on. Then, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life with a pistol shot to the head, while Eva Braun swallowed cyanide beside him. Their bodies were burned in the garden above, consumed in the wreckage of the Reich they had built. Even with Hitler dead, the fighting raged on. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, briefly assumed leadership but killed himself and his family days later. Other Nazi officials attempted to flee or negotiate, but Berlin dissolved into chaos. Soviet troops pressed through the city centre, raising the red flag over the Reichstag on May 2nd, a moment captured in one of the most famous photographs of the war. The symbol of Nazi power had fallen. Berlin was in Soviet hands. The cost of the battle was immense. Nearly 80,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and more than 250,000 wounded in the final assault. German losses were staggering, with hundreds of thousands killed, captured, or missing. Civilians suffered in numbers impossible to calculate, tens of thousands killed in bombardment, countless others victims of starvation, violence, or despair. The once mighty capital of the Reich was a shattered ruin, its streets littered with corpses, its monuments scarred by fire, its people broken. For Germany, the fall of Berlin was the end. On May 7th, German officials signed an unconditional surrender at Reims, France. On May 8th, the surrender was ratified in Berlin itself. The war in Europe was over. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, and New York, celebrating Victory in Europe Day, VE Day. Yet in Berlin there was no celebration, only silence and grief. For the survivors, the fall of Berlin was both liberation and devastation. Some felt relief that the nightmare was over. Others feared what came next. Refugees streamed across a continent broken by war, searching for homes that no longer existed. Families mourned loved ones lost in battle, in camps, in bombings, and in the shadows of Berlin's ruins, Allied troops uncovered evidence of crimes that shocked the conscience of the world. The concentration camps, the final solution, the machinery of genocide. The military defeat of the Reich was complete, but the moral reckoning had only begun. The image of Berlin in 1945 remains etched in history. A city in flames, soldiers raising flags over ruins, civilians emerging from basements to a world transformed. It was the end of one era and the violent birth of another. The Reich was gone, its leaders dead or hunted, its dreams turned to ash. From those ashes would rise not only new Germany's east and west, but a new world order shaped by the war's terrible cost. The fall of Berlin was not just the end of a battle. It was the end of the Second World War in Europe, the moment when the guns finally fell silent on the continent where the conflict had begun. It was the ultimate proof that tyranny built on fear and violence could never endure forever. And it was a warning, carved in stone and blood, of what happens when power is unchecked and humanity abandoned. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and Japan's surrender. The guns of Europe had fallen silent in May 1945, but across the vast Pacific, war still raged with terrible ferocity. Japan, though battered and cornered, refused to surrender. Entire cities lay in ruins from relentless American bombing. Its navy had been shattered at Midway, Leyte Gulf, and countless other battles. Its armies were pushed back from Burma, the Philippines, and the islands of the Central Pacific. Yet Tokyo remained defiant. To understand why the final days of the war in Asia unfolded with such intensity, one must see not only the military situation but the cultural mindset that shaped Japan's choices. For centuries, Japanese warriors had embraced a code of honor rooted in the samurai tradition. Surrender was shameful, death preferable to capture. This ethos, fused with modern nationalism, meant that even in the face of certain defeat, leaders urged resistance to the end. Soldiers fought to the last man on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Civilians too were drawn into the struggle armed with bamboo spears, trained to resist an expected invasion. The Japanese High Command prepared for a final battle on the home islands, hoping that American losses would be so great that Washington would negotiate rather than demand unconditional surrender. American leaders, however, had no intention of negotiating. Franklin Roosevelt had died in April, leaving Harry S. Truman as president. Truman, blunt and decisive, inherited a war that seemed poised to drag on indefinitely. The invasion of Japan Operation Downfall was being planned in detail. The first stage, Operation Olympic, would target Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, in November 1945. The second stage, Operation Coronet, would strike Honshu near Tokyo in spring 1946. Military estimates predicted hundreds of thousands of American casualties, perhaps more than 1 million. Japanese losses, military and civilian alike, would be staggering. For a nation already exhausted by years of war, such a prospect was daunting. But as these plans took shape, another weapon entered the stage, one unlike any the world had ever known. In secret, for years, the United States had been developing an atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project, led by physicist Robert Oppenheimer and General Leslie Groves, brought together the brightest scientific minds of the age. In hidden laboratories at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, they split the atom and harnessed its devastating energy. By summer 1945, the weapon was ready. On July 16th, in the desert of New Mexico, the first test took place. The device, nicknamed the Gadget, exploded in a blinding flash. A mushroom cloud rose miles into the sky. The desert floor turned to glass. Witnesses stood in awe and dread. Oppenheimer later recalled a line from Hindu scripture, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Truman, attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received word of the successful test. For him, it changed everything. The choice before Truman was stark: use the bomb and force Japan's surrender or launch a bloody invasion. American leaders debated the morality and necessity of the weapon. Some argued that conventional bombing and blockade would soon starve Japan into submission. Others believed that only a shocking blow could break the deadlock. Truman decided the bomb would be used. It would end the war quickly, save countless American lives, and demonstrate to the world, particularly the Soviet Union, the new power the United States possessed. On August 6, 1945, the mission was carried out. A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, lifted off from the island of Tinian. Its target was Hiroshima, a city of military significance but also a bustling civilian center of 300,000 people. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, was a uranium-based weapon. At 8:15 a.m., it was released. It fell silently for 43 seconds before detonating 1,900 feet above the city. What followed defies description. A flash brighter than the sun lit the sky. A fireball hotter than the surface of the sun consumed everything within hundreds of yards. Wooden houses burst into flame instantly. Concrete buildings collapsed. People walking in the streets were vaporized. Their shadows burned into walls. A shockwave flattened nearly 5 square miles of the city. Within moments, tens of thousands were dead. Fires spread uncontrollably, turning Hiroshima into a sea of flame. Those who survived the initial blast faced horrors. Skin hung in strips from bodies. Eyes were blinded by the flash. Burns covered flesh in grotesque patterns where clothing had shielded some parts but not others. People staggered through ruins in silence, their bodies blackened. And then came radiation, the invisible killer. Days later, survivors developed fevers, hair loss, vomiting. Many who had seemed uninjured died agonizing deaths. Hiroshima had ceased to exist as a functioning city. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb was dropped. The target was Nagasaki, a port city with shipyards and industries. The original target had been Kokura, but heavy clouds forced the bomber to divert. At 11:02 the plutonium bomb, nicknamed Fat Man, exploded. The terrain of Nagasaki hills and valleys somewhat limited the destruction, but it was still catastrophic. More than 40,000 died instantly. Tens of thousands more perished in the following weeks. Between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, over 100,000 people were killed outright. By the end of 1945, radiation and injuries raised the toll to more than 200,000. The vast majority were civilians, men, women, and children who had no voice in their nation's decisions. For survivors, known as hibakusha, the ordeal continued for decades. Many suffered from cancers, birth defects, and social stigma. Their testimony became a haunting reminder of nuclear war's human cost. Even after the bombings, Japan's leaders hesitated. The military still urged resistance, hoping to secure better terms. But then, on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, launching a massive invasion of Manchuria. Soviet armies swept aside Japanese forces, threatening to occupy northern Japan. Now faced with atomic destruction and Soviet conquest, the Japanese government could no longer delay. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio, the first time most Japanese had ever heard his voice. In solemn tones, he announced surrender. He did not use the word itself, but spoke of enduring the unendurable. For a society raised to see the emperor as divine, his words carried final authority. Across Japan, people wept, bowed, or sat in stunned silence. The war was over. Formal surrender came on September 2nd aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Representatives of Japan signed the documents as Allied leaders looked on. General Douglas MacArthur, overseeing the ceremony, declared, "We are gathered here to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored. It is my earnest hope that a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past." With that, the Second World War ended. The use of the atomic bomb remains one of history's most controversial decisions. Supporters argue it saved lives by avoiding invasion, forcing Japan's surrender swiftly. Critics contend Japan was already near collapse, and that other means could have ended the war without unleashing nuclear horror. Some view it as a demonstration to the Soviets as much as a strike against Japan. The debate continues, but what cannot be debated is the human cost. The images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain seared into memory. Cities are razed in seconds, survivors carrying scars for life. The bombings also opened a new chapter in human history, the nuclear age. Within 4 years, the Soviet Union tested its own bomb. The arms race began, casting a shadow of annihilation over the world. Hiroshima became not only a symbol of destruction, but also a warning. Survivors, the hibakusha, dedicated their lives to peace, telling their stories, urging nations to abandon nuclear weapons. Their voices, frail yet unyielding, asked the world never to repeat August 1945. For Japan, surrender marked both devastation and rebirth. The nation lay in ruins, cities destroyed, millions homeless, economy shattered. Yet, under Allied occupation, led by MacArthur, Japan rebuilt on democratic foundations. The emperor renounced divinity, a new constitution guaranteed rights, and the country embarked on a path that would transform it into a peaceful economic power. But the memories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained at the core of its identity, shaping its pacifist resolve. For the world, the war's end brought relief and grief in equal measure. Crowds celebrated VJ Day victory over Japan, dancing in the streets, kissing strangers, waving flags. But beneath the joy lay sorrow for the millions who had died in 6 years of global conflict. The war had ended, but it had changed humanity forever. The atomic bombings stand as both victory and tragedy. They ended the deadliest war in history, but opened the door to new dangers. They showed the power of science and the peril of its misuse. They raised questions of morality that echo still. What price peace? What limit to war? What responsibility to humanity? Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just the last battles of World War II. They were the first battles of a new world, the nuclear world, where humanity held in its hands the power to destroy itself. And they remain reminders that in war, even in victory, there are costs too great to measure, scars too deep to heal, and lessons that must never be forgotten. The Nuremberg trials. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Cities had been flattened, millions displaced, and tens of millions dead. Yet amid the rubble, another task loomed. A task not of rebuilding roads or homes, but of confronting the moral catastrophe of the war itself. Never before had the world seen crimes on such a scale. The Holocaust, mass executions, aggressive war, the slaughter of civilians, the wanton destruction of nations. The question arose, what should be done with the leaders of Nazi Germany, those who had conceived, ordered and overseen these horrors? In past wars, victors had often executed their enemies or exiled them without trial. After the First World War, the Allies had called for accountability but achieved little. Now, with the evidence of genocide and war crimes undeniable, a new idea emerged: justice through law. The Nuremberg trials would not simply punish, they would create a precedent, establishing that leaders could be held personally responsible for crimes against humanity. It was an ambitious, unprecedented experiment. The city chosen for the trials carried symbolic weight. Nuremberg had been the stage for massive Nazi rallies, where Hitler's speeches had whipped crowds into frenzy beneath swastika banners. It was here that the Nuremberg laws had codified racial hatred. Now, in poetic reversal, Nuremberg would become the place where Nazi leaders faced judgment. The International Military Tribunal, IMT, was formed by the four Allied powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and France. Judges and prosecutors from each nation gathered, united in purpose, though divided by ideology. They agreed on four major charges: crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, violations of the laws and customs of war, crimes against humanity, murder, extermination, enslavement, and other atrocities against civilians, conspiracy, participating in a common plan to commit the above crimes. The defendants were the highest-ranking surviving figures of the Reich men, whose names had been feared across Europe. Hermann Göring, once head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor. Joachim von Ribbentrop, foreign minister who signed pacts with dictators. Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Wehrmacht High Command. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy who had flown mysteriously to Britain in 1941. Hans Frank, the Butcher of Poland. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, senior SS officer. Albert Speer, armaments minister. In all, 24 men were indicted, though some were absent. Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels had killed themselves. Others were missing or dead. The trial began on November 20th, 1945. In the Palace of Justice, under heavy guard, the defendants sat in a dock, earphones on their heads for simultaneous translation. The world's press crowded into the chamber. Cameras recorded the proceedings. For the first time in history, the leaders of a defeated regime faced public trial for crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Films shot by Allied soldiers during the liberation of concentration camps were shown in court piles of corpses, skeletal survivors, gas chambers, crematoria. Witnesses testified, survivors of Auschwitz and Dachau, victims of forced labor, officials who had escaped the regime. Documents were read aloud, meticulous Nazi records of deportations, executions, and extermination orders. It became clear that the Holocaust was not the result of chaos or rogue commanders. It had been planned, coordinated, and executed by the machinery of state. Yet the trial was not without controversy. Defense attorneys argued that the tribunal represented victors' justice, that the Allies were punishing Germans for actions that were not clearly illegal at the time. They claimed defendants were just following orders. Some pointed to Allied bombing of cities like Dresden or the Soviet massacre at Katyn as crimes of their own. But the tribunal rejected these arguments. The scale and intent of Nazi crimes, it ruled, transcended the normal bounds of war. Goering, defiant and charismatic, tried to dominate the courtroom. He mocked witnesses, argued with judges, and sought to justify the regime. He insisted that everything Germany had done was in defense of its people. Yet even he could not dismiss the evidence. Ribbentrop wept when confronted with documents he had signed. Keitel, the obedient soldier, admitted to signing orders that led to the execution of thousands. Hess, unstable, sometimes sat in silence, sometimes ranted incoherently. Speer, the good Nazi, accepted responsibility in part, though he claimed ignorance of the Holocaust's full scale. The prosecution also faced challenges. Coordinating 4 different nations, each with its own legal traditions, was difficult. The Soviets insisted on emphasizing German aggression in the East while downplaying their own actions. The Americans and British focused on crimes against civilians and the Holocaust. The French sought recognition for occupation atrocities. Yet despite differences, they presented a united case that exposed the full horror of the Nazi regime. For survivors, the trials offered a measure of acknowledgement. Their suffering was recorded, their testimony preserved. The world could no longer deny or ignore what had happened. Millions who had no graves, whose voices had been silenced, were at least remembered in law. The verdicts came on October 1st, 1946. Of the 22 men who stood trial, 2 were deemed unfit or absent. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging. Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, and others faced the gallows. Goering, however, cheated justice. He swallowed a cyanide capsule the night before his execution. Hess was sentenced to life imprisonment. Speer received 20 years. Others were given various terms. A few were acquitted, though their reputations were forever tainted. The executions took place on October 16th, 1946, in a gymnasium converted into a gallows. Ribbentrop went first, declaring his loyalty to Hitler to the end. Keitel followed, then others. Their bodies were cremated, ashes scattered to prevent graves from becoming shrines. The Nuremberg trials did not end with the main tribunal. Subsequent trials prosecuted doctors who had conducted medical experiments, judges who had enforced racial laws, industrialists who had profited from forced labor, and SS leaders who had organized extermination. Together, these proceedings built a record of Nazi crimes and established principles of accountability that endure to this day. The legacy of Nuremberg was immense. It created the concept of crimes against humanity in international law. It established that just following orders is no defense for atrocities. It showed that leaders, not just soldiers, can be held accountable. It introduced the idea that even in war, there are universal moral limits that cannot be crossed. Critics remained. Some argued that Allied actions such as the atomic bombings or mass bombings of German cities were left unexamined. Others feared that trials conducted by victors could never be fully impartial. Yet the achievement of Nuremberg was undeniable. It laid the foundation for later tribunals in Rwanda, Yugoslavia, and the creation of the International Criminal Court. It also sent a message to the future, that genocide and aggression would not be forgotten, even if perfect justice was impossible. For the German people, the trials forced a confrontation with the crimes committed in their name. Many had claimed ignorance, but the evidence was public and undeniable. Slowly, painfully, Germany began the process of reckoning with its past. For the world, Nuremberg became a symbol of justice after horror, a sign that law could be stronger than vengeance, that memory could be enshrined not just in grief but in judgment. The Nuremberg courtroom still stands today. Visitors can see the dock where Goering once sat, the witness stand where survivors testified, the photographs and documents preserved. It is a place of memory and warning. For in that chamber, amid the ashes of war, humanity tried to draw a line that said, never again. And though history has shown that atrocities did not end with 1,945, the principles of Nuremberg remain. Every time a leader faces trial for war crimes, every time the phrase crimes against humanity is invoked, it is Nuremberg speaking. The tribunal did not heal the wounds of war, but it gave the world a language to name them, a framework to confront them, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, justice is worth pursuing. The Nuremberg trials were not only about punishing the guilty, they were about defining the future, about saying that humanity, though scarred, would not let such crimes pass into silence. They were about ensuring that the victims of the Holocaust, the millions who perished in camps, ghettos and battlefields, would not vanish into the void without recognition. And they were about hope that out of law, truth and memory, a new world could be built. The birth of the United Nations. The Second World War had ended in thunder and silence. Thunder in the bombings, the artillery, the tanks rolling through ruined capitals. Silence in the mass graves, the camps, the shattered homes where voices no longer answered. More than 70 million lay dead. Entire cities, Warsaw, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima, had been erased or reduced to charred skeletons. Families were scattered across continents, millions of refugees wandering roads with no country to call home. From Asia to Europe, humanity looked around at the devastation and asked, how do we keep this from happening again? The question was not new. After the First World War, a similar cry had arisen. Out of that earlier catastrophe came the League of Nations, designed to preserve peace. But the League had been too weak, too divided, too ignored. When Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, when Hitler marched into the Rhineland, when Japan occupied Manchuria, the League had issued words but no action. By the late 1930s, it was irrelevant. The world had learned the cost of that failure. If another organization were to rise, it would have to be stronger, broader, and equipped with the authority to act. The idea for such a body emerged even before the war was won. In August 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill met aboard a ship off the coast of Newfoundland. There they drafted the Atlantic Charter, a vision of a world after victory. It pledged no territorial gains, the right of peoples to choose their governments, freedom of trade and seas, and global cooperation to maintain peace. Though vague, it was a blueprint for a new order. The phrase United Nations itself was coined by Roosevelt in 1942, when 26 countries signed the declaration by United Nations, vowing to fight the Axis and not to make separate peace. The name captured the essence of alliance, unity, and collective struggle. As the war ground on, leaders realized this wartime coalition might form the nucleus of a peacetime institution. In 1944, representatives of the Big Four, the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China, met at Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C. There, they debated how a new international organization would function. The debates were intense. Smaller nations feared domination by great powers. The Soviets demanded veto rights to protect their security. The Americans wanted universal membership, but also practical mechanisms. Out of these talks came the rough architecture, a General Assembly where every nation had a voice, a Security Council of major powers with real authority, and specialized agencies to address humanitarian and economic needs. By spring 1945, with Germany near defeat, momentum built. 50 nations gathered in San Francisco in April for the United Nations Conference on International Organization. The war was not yet over. Fighting raged in the Pacific, but already the delegates sought to prevent the next conflict. They met in crowded halls, debated in committees, hammered out compromises word by word. The atmosphere was charged with urgency and hope. Survivors of war crimes gave testimony. Refugees crowded the city streets. Delegates walked past posters proclaiming, "Peace is the new victory." The most contentious issue was the Security Council. Would the major powers truly cooperate? The United States, Soviet Union, Britain, China, and later France would hold permanent seats, each with veto power. Many smaller nations protested. Was this not simply enshrining great power dominance? But without this compromise, the great powers would never join. The memory of the League's weakness was fresh. Without the weight of the strongest nations, the new body would collapse. So the veto was accepted, a necessary flaw in a fragile design. On June 26, 1945, the United Nations Charter was signed. Its opening words echoed the determination of survivors everywhere. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. It pledged to reaffirm human rights, promote social progress, and practice tolerance. The Charter created 6 principal organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, the International Court of Justice, and the Secretariat. It gave the UN the ability to send peacekeepers, authorize collective military action, impose sanctions, and coordinate humanitarian aid. In October 1945, after enough nations ratified the Charter, the United Nations officially came into being. Its headquarters would eventually rise in New York City, a glass tower overlooking the East River. But its spirit belonged to the world. Flags of member nations would fly side by side, symbols of fragile unity after a century's greatest storm. The early work of the UN was immense. Millions of displaced persons needed food, shelter, and resettlement. Entire nations lay in rubble. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA, established during the war, transitioned into UN agencies that fed millions, distributed clothing, and repatriated refugees. In 1946, UNICEF was created to aid children, providing milk, medicine, and hope in devastated lands. The World Health Organization, established in 1948, fought disease outbreaks, recognizing that health and peace were linked. Perhaps the most ambitious early achievement was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948. Drafted under the leadership of Eleanor Roosevelt, it proclaimed that all people, regardless of race, religion, or nationality, possessed fundamental rights to life, liberty, security, education, and dignity. Though not legally binding, it became a moral compass cited by activists and nations alike in struggles for justice. Yet the UN's birth was not without shadows. Even as delegates signed the Charter, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union deepened. The Cold War loomed. The very veto power designed to keep peace often paralyzed the Security Council. In crises from Berlin to Korea, the UN found itself both vital and limited. Still, the fact that nations debated rather than fought under its roof was itself a fragile victory. Symbolism mattered. The image of soldiers in blue helmets, standing between warring sides, became a global emblem of peacekeeping. Though imperfect, these missions saved lives in conflicts where outright war might have erupted. The UN also became a stage for new nations emerging from colonialism. As Asia, Africa, and the Middle East gained independence, they joined the Assembly, turning it into a truly global forum. The birth of the UN marked a turning point in world history. For the first time, humanity attempted to create a permanent institution for global governance, one that combined law, diplomacy, humanitarian work, and security. It was not flawless. It could not erase conflict, but it embodied the lesson carved into the rubble of World War II, that peace could not be left to chance. that dialogue was better than destruction, that humanity's survival required cooperation. The legacy of 1945 was not only the defeat of fascism, but the determination to build something enduring from its ashes. The United Nations became the imperfect vessel of that determination. In its halls, the world would argue, accuse, and clash, but also negotiate, compromise, and sometimes prevent catastrophe. Every resolution, every mission, every speech echoed the memory of the war that birthed it. For survivors, the UN was a promise that their suffering had meaning, that the world had learned. For nations, it was a chance to shape the future together. For humanity, it was a reminder that in the face of destruction, cooperation was the only path forward. The United Nations did not erase conflict, nor could it, but in its founding, the world glimpsed a possibility that even after the greatest war in history, even after genocide and nuclear fire, humanity could still choose hope.